Now a hearing on the President's $82 billion request for Iraq. Defense Secretary Rumsfeld testifies, along with Joint Chiefs Chairman General Richard Myers. The two also discussed current operations in Iraq, including when U.S. troops could begin to come home. The House Armed Services Committee meets for just over 3 hours.
The committee will come to order. With the arrival of the President's budget request last week and the supplemental appropriations request on Monday, Washington has officially launched the annual budget ritual. This year's cycle brings with it a number of important policy and budgetary decisions that will receive considerable debate and attention over the coming few months. However, it's critical that the coming budget battles, while important, don't overshadow the most compelling policy questions facing our nation. Mainly, we are a nation at war in a complex and rapidly changing security environment. The daily headlines out of Iraq, Afghanistan, Iran, or North Korea should be a constant reminder of this fact. At the same time, our armed forces are experiencing the most severe challenges and demands that have been placed on them in decades. This critical instrument of American national security policy is undergoing sweeping and fundamental change while simultaneously carrying most of the free world's burden in the global war on terrorism. We should recognize these circumstances as necessary and in keeping with our nation's interest. However, we must also recognize that these circumstances place policy choices before us of extraordinary importance that will shape the future security of our nation, the long-term effectiveness of our military, and the welfare of our men and women in uniform. And in this regard, I'm concerned that as a nation we are gradually shifting focus away from these national security challenges to other pressing concerns with a corresponding shift in policy and resource priorities. Today we begin our annual review of the President's proposal on how to best provide for the common defense of this great nation in the year to come. We do this as hundreds of thousands of brave American men and women are fighting for our interests and security around the world. We must ensure that we are providing them with all the material and moral support that we can muster so that we can effectively accomplish their mission and return to their loved ones safely. The legislation that comes out of this process is only part of the solution. I know that the members of this committee will do everything possible to advance this goal. But this goal also requires a commitment by all of us involved to set aside business as usual, promote innovative solutions, take process risks, and begin to move our massive bureaucratic systems in a direction where we can better adapt to the rapidly changing threats facing our forces. So, Mr. Secretary, as you prepare to assess the strategic direction of the Department of Defense through the Quadrennial Defense Review, I trust that all these matters will be fully addressed. However, it is of particular importance that the policy decisions that emerge from this review are based on sound analysis of the defense needs of the nation and not artificial budget constraints or similar political limitations. So we all look forward to working with you and your team in the year ahead and to your testimony today as you help us understand how the budget process and proposal addresses the many difficult security challenges facing our nation. And Mr. Secretary, before you get started and before I turn to my colleague, Mr. Skelton, let me just say that this committee, in its oversight role, often points out, as Teddy Roosevelt said in his famous Man in the Arena speech, how the strong man stumbled. We've been the critics. That's an important part of our role. But I think it's also important to point out that that in the national security apparatus, this great team that starts with the guys carrying the rifles in those squads in Fallujah and Mosul and other difficult areas, going door to door, right up through the ranks and up through to the top of the leadership pyramid into your offices, that you do and your team does a lot of things right, and that that there's been lots of folks that have laid out what they think was an alternative roadmap to the occupation of Iraq, and I'm reminded that the road that you don't travel is always smoother, but that no occupations are easy. They've never been easy, from the occupations that we engaged in World War II to the present day. They're always difficult for the occupied nation and the occupying nation. And through the struggles and efforts and sacrifices of your team of uniformed personnel, we've carried this nation, Iraq, to a position in which people walked down on one day a few days ago and cast ballots in large numbers. And even those of us who embrace democracy and believe in it and tout it to the world are sometimes surprised, I think, by the enthusiasm with which other people yearn for it and ultimately exercise it when they get a chance. The fighting forces of the United States carried this election on their shoulders. And so I think it's appropriate just to give you a nod of commendation and to give all of the people that serve under in your team thanks for the fact that we've, in very difficult circumstances, we've walked this process to the point where the Iraqi people have voted, as have the people in Afghanistan, and that they have a fighting chance of having a nation with a modicum of freedom and an enduring representative government. That's an extraordinary thing. We have lots of challenges in front of us, but I think it's not a bad thing to take a pause in these series of oversight hearings in which a lot of our attention is devoted to things that aren't working, to let you know that we appreciate those things that do work, and that this great success that occurred just a short time ago is in a very large part a result of your efforts and the efforts of this great team of men and women who comprise the uniformed forces of the United States. So thank you, and thank you, General Myers, and thanks to all of your great personnel. And before we get started, we're going to take all comments will be formal statements will be taken into the record without objection. But before we get started, let me turn to my good colleague, the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Skelton, for any remarks he'd like to make.
Mr. Chairman, let me join you in welcoming Secretary Rumsfeld and General Myers this morning. General, I want to thank you at the outset for your leadership and for the men and women that you lead. Every day they uphold the highest standards of service, professionalism, of courage, and we recognize the extraordinary sacrifices that they, as well as their families, make, and we commend their service. We are so very, very proud of them. My comments this morning, Mr. Chairman, come about as a result of, I suppose, being the longest-serving member of this committee, of years of studying the military, particularly military history. History doesn't necessarily repeat itself, but it sure rhymes an awful lot. And having mentors that took their time to teach me to ask questions, to raise issues about this very difficult but important subject of war. I had mentors, I'm blessed with mentors, Maxwell Thurman, Chuck Boyd, Jack Galvin, and others who took their time to visit with me. So as I make my remarks, it's upon that background. Mr. Chairman, as we approach the 2-year mark since the commencement of Operation Iraqi Freedom, we must recognize the demands placed on our forces. This is particularly due to extended deployments, but largely because we've not had an effective post-conflict strategy. We made some critical errors in the period immediately following major hostilities, and we lack a strategy for success now. I say this not because the elections weren't successful, they were. We're very pleased that they were. But elections are only one step. 2 years into our involvement in Iraq, there should be a strategy for success. There's a parallel in Iraq to the insurgency that drove the French from Algeria. Iraq has become a come one, come all operation for terrorists. If we don't win there, it could be the tipping point for the Persian Gulf for many, many years. And I'm not suggesting we withdraw. I'm suggesting that we have a clear plan to succeed. We must succeed in Iraq. We must succeed there. Do we understand the insurgency that we and the Iraqis are fighting? Iraqi intelligence director recently said there are 40,000 hardcore insurgents and 200,000 part-time fighters and volunteers. General Casey estimates that we've either killed or captured 15,000 insurgents in the last 7 months. If we had lost 15,000 of our own troops in a comparable period, we would see diminished combat capability, and yet our enemy seems to be adapting and increasing his attacks. The chart that is placed over here, which is the Department of Defense chart, using publicly available information, shows that the attacks have on the average increased over a period of time of his losses. What does this tell us about our understanding of the insurgency? Even if we don't have a good handle on the size of the insurgency, we must still have an effective strategy for success. What is the success strategy that will allow us to leave a strong and sufficient Iraq in the hands of Iraqis and to bring our troops home to their families or onward to other missions? How is economic reconstruction money being used to weaken the insurgency and strengthen support for the Iraqi government? How will we support and help secure the next steps in the Iraqi political process? Assuming the insurgency stays at current levels, how many Iraqi security forces will be needed specifically to counter that threat? Putting a number on this, I know, can be difficult. But we size our forces against a range of other threats all the time. We put a number on the divisions, the air wings, the carrier battle groups. We must be able to put a figure on the capabilities of the Iraqis if we are to succeed. We must finish the job in Iraq, but of course we can't stay forever. We could win the war in Iraq, but emerge the weaker for it. We need a plan because we know that history will not wait for us. Our other situations will demand our attention. Mr. Chairman, just in the time I've been in Congress, we've deployed to more places than I can really easily recall. Grenada, Haiti, Bosnia, Kosovo, Somalia, as well as the current conflicts. The Army's own estimate tells us if operations ended today, it would still take 2 years to get the force ready to take on another conflict. We continue to lose partner countries from Operation Iraqi Freedom. Poland is decreasing its forces by a third. Others like Netherlands, Norway, Philippines, Hungary, Portugal are either out or pulling out. This trend raises questions about our friends' capability and their willingness to fight with us in future operations. We have potential crises on several fronts, from Iran, North Korea, to the simmering tensions in the Taiwan Straits. And some people say that's the most dangerous place on earth. We must have the capability to deter or, if need, to respond to aggressive action from those quarters. As importantly, we must have the respect of our allies and friends to work toward common solutions to their challenges. I'm concerned that our current action in Iraq put both at risk. Global leadership requires both managing short-term crises and making long-term strategic choices. And Mr. Secretary, you're in the process now of undertaking the quadrennial defense review and re-examining the strategy, the capabilities, and a variety of issues that flow from that, and all of the threats I mentioned just a few moments ago. This review does not happen in a vacuum. That's why we have to have a strategy and why we have war colleges with the nation's best strategic thinkers. The National Military Strategy drafted by Chairman Myers but delivered to the Secretary's office was due exactly 1 year ago, February 15, 2004, and it has not been submitted to Congress. At a time when we're deployed in numerous contingencies, this committee should have the benefit of General Myers and other senior military officers thinking about our strategy and the forces we need to execute it. Why have we not received this document? The forces we need to execute our ongoing missions have been a matter of great debate in this committee, and last year As you know, we increased in-strength in the defense authorization bill, and I'm pleased to see you maintain that increased in-strength level. But I do not believe it should be paid for from supplemental funds. And why is it not being paid for as we recommended by law in the regular budget? In general, I must tell you I'm pleased with the increased level of funding by the bill. It does many good things for our troops. But we should be paying for ongoing expenses like in-strength and cost of Army modularity in the base budget rather than the supplemental. And, Mr. Secretary, we must deal with the crisis in shipbuilding. With a plan in this year's budget to build only 4 ships, the Navy surface force will dip to 289. What happened to Ronald Reagan's 600-ship Navy, or even the last Quadrennial Defense Review's 310-ship Navy? Our ships may be getting more capable, but the oceans aren't getting any smaller. Mr. Secretary, thank you for your service. General Myers, thank you for your service. We appreciate you being with us. We look forward to your answers. For all of us are on the same team to do the very, very best we can for those young men, young women in uniform who make us so very proud. Thank you.
I thank the gentleman, and Mr. Secretary, before you begin, I neglected to say one other thing, and that is that the gentleman sitting next to you, General Myers, your chief advisor and chief military advisor for the President, also has an obligation to give his unvarnished position and opinion and his best advice to the Congress, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. I just wanted to say to you that you have in that gentleman, and we have in that gentleman, a real chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And during this last debate and passage, workup and passage of the Intel bill, we asked General Myers to give his position, which is his statutory obligation to do. While that position, when he gave it to us and made it available to the Senate, also he received some criticism from the Senate for giving his best recommendation and his best advice as we worked up that critical piece of legislation. And I just wanted to say publicly what I've told him privately, which is that he not only contributed to that process, but that his advice, his best opinion on that legislation was not only important, it was critical. That we have his input as we put together this fairly massive piece of legislation. He did exactly what he's obligated to do under the Constitution and under our laws and under his obligation to the committee and to the Congress and to the President. And General Myers, you've always given us your very best unvarnished and candid position on matters military. We appreciate that, and we thank you for it. And that's allowed us to do lots of things in this last several years in terms of serving not only the uniformed personnel of this country, but the security apparatus of the country and the American people. So thank you, General Myers, for your service also.
Yes, sir. Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
I must point out you can't go wrong with a good country boy from Kansas.
You know, that's very true, General Myers. And let me say to my colleagues too. We had a number of I fell down on the job the last 2 hearings ago when we've got a big committee with and everybody has questions, and I just served the more junior members of the committee by pontificating for long periods of time myself, and by allowing folks to go far beyond the 5-minute rule on the first couple of rows. And because of that, we didn't get to about half the members of the committee for questions. I'm going to try to reform myself and offer a modicum of discipline to the committee on this, because everybody's got a question. I know for the Secretary and for the Chief, and so. We're going to have the 5-minute rule. We're going to adhere to the 5-minute rule. And Mr. Secretary and General Myers, we're going to need your cooperation too, because I want 5 minutes per member. And I've always been the master of being able to ask 5 questions during my time and then ask all 3 witnesses to answer them, which means you get 15 answers, and that takes a lot of time. But I would ask when you to try to wrap up your answers to your questions within the 5 minutes. So you'll see that light. Please watch it and try to keep if you can in your response keep us in our 5-minute boxes. We'll try to get through our entire committee in this hearing. So, having said that, having laid out the impossible dream, Mr. Secretary, thank you for being with us. Thanks for your service to the country. The floor is yours, sir.
Mr. Chairman, just for a little clarity here, is the 5 minutes include the questions and the answers, or is it 5 minutes for the questions and 5 minutes for the answers?
5 minutes, questions and answers. So I'm asking in all the members, that means you're going to be able to ask 1 good question or make 1 good speech, but not several.
In which case there's no answer.
That's right.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for your comments. Congressman Skelton, members of the committee, good morning. I also have with me, besides the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Dick Myers, we have Tina Jonas, who's the Undersecretary of the Department of Defense and Controller. And behind us is Dr. David Chu, who's an Undersecretary for Personnel and Readiness. Somewhere in the world, as we speak, young men and women wearing our country's uniform are engaged in the very hard work of history. Their families are concerned about their safety, and they're making the best of their absence. Somewhere a soldier, a sailor, an airman, or a Marine is wounded, determined to get back to duty. And here in the United States, hundreds of thousands of dedicated military and civilian personnel are devoting long hours to our country's defense. I know they are comforted and encouraged by the outpouring of support that they receive from the American people. And many of you, as you have met with the wounded in the military hospitals. Their dedication is inspiring. We thank them for their valor and their sacrifice. With your permission, Mr. Chairman, I will submit for the record my full testimony, which outlines in considerable detail the proposals we're recommending.
Without objection.
However, before discussing dollars, programs, and weapons, I'd like to provide some context for the task ahead. Consider what has taken place since we met here in early 2001. 2 newly free nations, Afghanistan and Iraq, now reside in 2 of the world's most violent regions. Afghan and Iraqis have held historic elections to choose moderate Muslim leadership. Extremists are under pressure worldwide, their false promises slowly being exposed as another cruel lie of history. America's national security apparatus is seeing historic changes. NATO is undergoing reforms in both organization and mission, expanding its size and deploying forces outside of the traditional European boundaries. And some 60 nations are freshly engaged in an unprecedented multinational effort to halt proliferation of the world's most dangerous weapons. These issues will no doubt require the focus of U.S. security policies in the years to come. They have and will continue to affect the Department's pace and direction. There was little appetite to consider the new lethal threats that lingered on as irritants while the country tackled other challenges. The President understood we were entering an era of the unexpected and unpredictable and was concerned about that our country was not sufficiently prepared. We have confronted and are seeking to meet many challenges, including the challenge of having to move military forces rapidly across the globe, the urgency of functioning as a truly joint force, as opposed to simply keeping various military services out of each other's way, the need to recognize that we're engaged in a war and yet still functioning under peacetime constraints, regulations, requirements, and we're against an enemy that is unconstrained by laws or bureaucracies. And finally, the need to adjust to a world where the threat is not from one superpower, but from rogue regimes and extremist cells that can work together, share information, and proliferate lethal capabilities. The question many of us wrestled with back then to deal with these challenges are relevant today. For example, are the armed services properly organized to deal with the uncertainties we face? We realized that the military services Cold War arrangements were ill-suited for the new warfare of the future. So we set about making U.S. forces more agile and more expeditionary. When we say agile, some people seem to think it means making the military smaller. It does not. It's the shape of the forces, not the size, that it refers to. And that is the impetus for making the needed changes. We're making major commitment to modernizing the Army, adding $35 billion over the next 7 years in addition to the $13 billion in the Army's baseline budget. The Army will increase its deployable combat power significantly, expanding from 33 active duty maneuver brigades to 43 considerably more powerful brigade combat teams. These teams can deploy quickly to trouble spots and will have enough firepower, armor, and logistics to sustain operations over time. I think there's a chart up there that points out that with 33 active brigades, the time at home is about 1.2 years per year deployed. When going to 43 active brigades, we get a 50% increase up to 1.8 years time at home between deployments. The Navy's also changing. Our country's potential foes currently have fleets that are regional, not international. The new challenge is to be able to protect concentrated naval power more quickly to confront unexpected threats. The Navy is developing the joint sea basing concept that will allow expeditionary strike forces to project power quickly from floating platforms without being dependent on land bases. We also asked, how do we deal with the inevitability of surprise? Well, we can be certain who might attack our people. We can't be certain. We can reasonably predict, however, how they might attack through terrorism, cyber attack, weapons of mass destruction, and other asymmetric approaches. And we asked, how ought we to reassess our plans, operations, and force structure in light of the technological advances of the past decades? Technological advances and better organization have allowed the military to generate considerably more combat capability with the same, or in some cases, fewer numbers of weapon platforms. The chart, I'm afraid it's hidden, so I can't see it behind the lady doing the... That chart indicates roughly that there are, in 1982 and during Desert Storm, we had the ability for multiple aircraft per target of about 200 targets per day. And during Operation Iraqi Freedom, we're up to about 700 targets per day. So you get a sense of the changes that technology have provided. Let me describe a few examples. Where once the Air Force and Navy planned in terms of sorties per target, they now assign targets per sortie. As late as 1997, aircraft from a carrier could engage, as I say, about 200 targets per day. Now it's well over 600. A B-2 bomber can now be configured to attack as many as 80 different targets with 80 precision munitions on one sortie. Here's an example from the Navy. In the past, the Navy maintained a rigid deployment schedule. Ships would deploy for 6 months, overlapping with ships that they relieved. Upon arriving home, they became relatively useless. They were training and equipment readiness plummeted to what became known as the bathtub, with many, if not most, battle groups unavailable for missions. Assuming you had 12 battleships, it was like having 9 of them inactive at any given time. You had 3 with the capability of surging for 2. If you're in business, it would be like having 12 manufacturing facilities and only using 3 of them with the ability to bring 2 of them, additional ones, online. The Navy's new fleet response plan has the capability to surge 5 or 6 carrier strike groups in 30 days with the ability to deploy an additional 2 in 90 days. That's an enormous change in combat capability for the United States of America. We also asked, with the Cold War over, are our forces positioned in the smartest way to deal with these new multiple challenges? The post-Cold War environment suggested the need to conduct an audit, in a sense, of where forces were stationed across the globe. There seemed to be better ways of deterring aggression overseas than stationing heavy divisions in fixed defensive positions. We have advanced the common sense, but then novel notion that our troops should be where they're needed, where they're wanted, and where they could be the most usable. In consultation with Congress and our friends and allies abroad, the Department is making long overdue changes in U.S. global basing, moving away from obsolete Cold War garrisons and placing emphasis on the ability to surge quickly to trouble spots across the globe. And finally, we asked, are there changes needed in the way the Pentagon operated? 4 years ago, acquisition policies were 200 pages long on the average. Today, they're about 34 pages. The Department has adopted evolutionary approach to acquisitions, seeking to deliver technology as it's available, rather than waiting for entire systems to be complete. This spiral development approach has allowed us, for example, to more rapidly field robots to detonate roadside bombs in Iraq. Inefficiency is always unfortunate. In the Department of Defense, however, it can be deadly. An idea ignored may be the next threat overlooked. A person performing a redundant task is a person not contributing to our defense. A dollar wasted is a dollar not invested in the warfighter. The demands on the Department could not be met effectively until the bureaucracy was pushed, encouraged, and sometimes dragged into the 21st century. The changes I've outlined and many others were getting underway somewhat before September 11, 2001. The military's skillful campaigns might have been longer and less successful had the country not already begun to adopt needed reforms. Because we had begun to consider changes to U.S. global posture, we had a head start in contemplating new forward operating sites in territories closer to the extremist centers of operation. With many of these tasks now well underway, President Bush continues to set an ambitious course to prepare for the challenging times ahead. The United States' overriding priority will be to continue prosecuting the war and to attack its ideological underpinnings. I've been asked why war costs are included in supplemental appropriations rather than in annual Defense Department budgets. Let me explain. The annual budget process takes up to 12 months for the Department of Defense to plan our budget. We're already started on the next year's budget for the year after the coming year. And then we have to clear it through OMB. Then it takes 8 or 9 or 10 months to pass it through the Congress. And then it takes 12 months after that to execute it. That can be a period of some 2.5 years. In war, circumstances on the ground can change quickly. And what was not an urgent necessity at one point of a conflict might well prove to be urgent in the next, as the enemy's strategy shifts and as new challenges arrive. Supplemental appropriations are prepared much closer to the time the funds are needed. As this chart shows, this allows for somewhat more accurate estimates of costs and, more importantly, quicker access to the needed funds. After more than 3 years of conflict, two central realities of this war are quite clear. The first is that the struggle cannot be won by military means alone. The Defense Department must continue to work with other government agencies to successfully employ all instruments of national power. While DoD has sent soldiers to distant battlefields, the Department of Treasury has uncovered financial support lines. The Department of State has helped cultivate new alliances. The Department of Justice has apprehended suspects within our boundaries. And the Department of Homeland Security has helped to protect ports and borders. We can no longer think of neat, clear walls between departments and agencies, or even committees of jurisdiction in Congress. The tasks ahead are far too complex to remain wedded to those old divisions. A second reality of the new era is that the United States can't win this global struggle alone. Clearly, it will take cooperation among a great many nations to stop weapons proliferation, for example. It takes a great many nations working together to locate and dismantle global extremist cells. It takes a great many nations to gather and share the intelligence that's crucial to stopping future attacks. Our friends and allies are increasingly aware that the danger confronting America is at their doorsteps as well, as underscored by attacks in Madrid, Bali, Beslan, Casablanca, Riyadh, Istanbul, and elsewhere. We encourage you in Congress to support a global peace operations initiative to be managed by the State Department that will help other less developed countries train to send peacekeeping forces and stabilization forces to potential crisis spots. And we ask Congress to allow the United States to offer more incentives and capabilities to friends and allies battling insurgents who need help in training and equipping their own forces. There's no more vivid example of this than the Iraqi security forces. They demonstrated considerable valor during the operations to liberate Fallujah and in providing security for Iraq's successful recent democratic election. When talking about the Iraqi security forces, some people seem to want to focus on numbers, so let's talk a bit about the numbers here. The Iraqis have gone from 0 trained and equipped new Iraqi security personnel on duty. In 2003, they currently have, if you add up police, border officials, National Guard, etc., Army, they have 136,000. And there are an additional 74,000 site protection people who we no longer count in the 136,000 because they were transferred out of the Ministry of Interior of Iraq. But beyond numbers, capability is important. And capability is a function partly of numbers, to be sure, but also of training equipment, leadership, mobility, sustainability, access to intelligence, and experience. Now, one can't expect that an Iraqi security force coming out of their training pipeline will be a battle-hardened veteran like the fine men and women of the U.S. military. But those who continue to unfairly denigrate Iraqi security forces should be reminded that they would not have lost, killed in action, 1,392 police and soldiers if they'd been hunkered down hiding in their barracks. They haven't been. They provided the inner and outer perimeter protection for 5,000 polling places in Iraq on election day. Today, weapon platforms are more lethal and precise, but still not flexible enough. Force deployments are faster, but not yet fast enough. The Pentagon bureaucracy is more efficient, but not yet efficient enough. And in constructing a comprehensive strategy for the future, we sought to answer these difficult questions. What must our forces be capable of doing in the next 5, 10, 20 years? What must be done to move us urgently in the directions that will best protect the American people? What lessons have we learned during the past 3+ years of warfare that can lead us to better calibrate and refine our strategies against the enemies, who, lest we forget, have brains? They watch what we do, they adapt to what we do, just as we watch what they do and adapt to what they do. Stress on the force has been mentioned in the opening remarks. We know, for example, that there are strains on our forces, and particularly on the ground forces. By the end of September, the size of the Army strength is planned to have increased by more than 29,000 soldiers from the troop levels 4 years ago. That does not include the activated National Guard and Reserve forces. In fact, let me show you how U.S. ground forces compare to where they were in 2001. The chart indicates that our end strength under the emergency powers is considerably higher and has been considerably higher than the so-called statutory end strength. We have been able to do that, as I say, under emergency powers. Additionally, ground forces are transitioning from being a garrison force to an expeditionary force, from being fundamentally a peacetime army preparing for a major conventional conflict to an army dealing with dispersed and dangerous thinking enemies who operate in small cells, free of democratic constraints and free of large bureaucracies. In this conflict, we've used reserve component forces at a much higher level than in past decade. A chart that's up on the easel at the moment shows that we have the proportion of reserves and National Guards that we've mobilized since 2001 is significant, but it is somewhat less than 50%. I should emphasize that this reflects individuals mobilized and not mobilized, and it is not designed to portray the units mobilized. Further, the Army is enlarging considerably its pool of deployable soldiers and units so that individual reservists and guardsmen in particularly high-demand specialties will need to be mobilized less often and for shorter periods and with more notice and predictability. For example, the Army is reducing the number of artillery and air defense units and adding military, police, transportation, special forces, skills that have been increasingly needed in the global war on terror. Other innovations underway will also contribute to force capability. Tens of thousands of positions previously held by uniformed military personnel, mostly administrative and facilities related, are already being converted to civilian and contractor duties, thereby freeing up additional tens of thousands of military personnel for military responsibilities. Those add in strength in terms of combat capability, even though the institutional size of the military may stay the same. In addition, because of the substantial and long overdue changes in U.S. global force posture, some 70,000 troops and 100,000 family members and civilian employees will be leaving overseas bases and returning to the United States, where they and their families will have shorter overseas deployments and considerably less disruption in their life. We asked what lessons have been learned about the enemy and its tactics. The enemies have brains, they watch our actions and change constantly. The current threats posed by the insurgents are roadside bombs and rockets targeting coalition troops on the ground. The military has made it a very high priority to accelerate production of body armor and up-armored Humvees. Let me show you what that means. The Army has stepped up production of armored Humvees by more than 1,000% since mid-2003, when its forces began to face the improvised explosive device threat in Iraq, going from 35 per month in May of 2003 to 450 monthly by December 2004. I'm told by General Casey that as of this week, with a few exceptions, U.S. military vehicles in Iraq carrying American troops outside of protected areas will have appropriate armor. In addition, since March 2003, the military has produced in excess of 400,000 sets of body armor. That was up from 1,200 sets produced per month to over 25,000 sets produced per month. The Department recognizes the critical importance of safeguarding the troops in the field, so the military has made force protection institutionalized across the services as part of their core capabilities. Another challenge the Department faces is attracting and retaining high-caliber people that serve in key positions. For decades, the Department has lived with personnel practices that would be totally unacceptable in any business. With the support of Congress and other federal agencies, the Department is now instituting a new personnel system designed to provide greater flexibility in hiring, assignments, and promotion, and allowing managers to put the right people in the right positions where they're needed. About 60,000 DoD employees, the first spiral in a wave of over 300,000, will transition to the National Security Personnel System as early as July of this year. As I mentioned earlier, over the coming years, with the support of Congress, heavy Cold War garrisons will be replaced by logistical and training facilities that can be accessed quickly and without extensive negotiation or legal constraints in foreign countries. The new global security environment drives the approach to our domestic force posture as well. The Department continues to maintain more military bases and facilities that are needed, consuming and diverting valuable personnel and resources. Base realignment and closure, or BRAC, will allow the Department to reconfigure its current infrastructure to one that maximizes warfighting capability and efficiency. And it could provide substantial savings now. Money that can be used to improve the quality of life for our men and women in uniform, for force protection, and investments in needed weapon systems. Mr. Chairman, these are some of the reforms we plan to implement over the coming years with the help of your committee and the Congress. We know there will be a resistance to some of these reforms. It's always difficult to depart from the known and the comfortable. Abraham Lincoln once compared reorganizing the Union Army during the Civil War to bailing out the Potomac River with a teaspoon. I hope and trust that what we're proposing and what we must accomplish will not prove to be that difficult, although I know it will be tough. But consider the challenges our country faces, not only to reorganize the Army, which is a major project, but to better organize all of the military services, plus transform the enormous defense bureaucracy, fight 2 wars, and if that were not enough, to be fighting a war for the first time in history in an era with so many new realities. Think of it. 24-hour worldwide satellite news coverage, including terrorist attacks, disasters, and combat operations, cell phones, digital cameras, global internet, emails, embedded reporters, an increasingly casual regard for the protection of classified documents and information, and a U.S. government that's basically still organized for the last century, not the information age. And all of this, not in a conventional conflict for which the U.S. military had spent decades training and equipping, but in an unconventional war against asymmetric threats from enemies totally unburdened by bureaucracies and legal constraints. The task is daunting. I'm reminded of a story by Ronald Reagan used to tell. It seemed a young GI in Germany once asked a U.S. ambassador if he ever got to see President Reagan. The ambassador replied that he sometimes did get to see the president. The soldier said, "Well, you tell the president we're proud to be here and we ain't afraid of anybody." Not long after that, the GI heard President Reagan speak on Armed Forces radio. And as it happened, the president told the same story on the air, even repeating the soldier's words. And the soldier ran out of his barracks and shouted, "The system works! The system works!" Well, I believe that. I think that despite the daunting tasks we have to tackle, we can and will get the job done. Our country always seems to find a way. The system does work. And it's because the American people have such rooted, good common sense. And that, more than anything, is why America has the finest fighting force on the face of the earth, and we need to keep it that way. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for a very thorough statement, and Ms. Jonas, we welcome you also to the dais. General Myers, do you have a statement?
Mr. Chairman, I do. Mr. Chairman, Congressman Skelton, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to report on the state of the United States Armed Forces. And I request, like the Secretary did, to include my written statement in the record, Mr. Chairman. I would like to thank you for your unwavering support of our armed forces and our servicemen and women as we continue this struggle against extremism. Building democracy and hope in areas long ruled by terror and oppression is a long and hard task, as we all know. Our significant progress in Iraq and Afghanistan and other places around the world is a tribute to the hard work and sacrifice of our dedicated American service members and of our coalition partners. U.S. soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, Coast Guardsmen, and U.S. government civilians who have been killed or wounded, sacrificed to make the world safer and provide hope to millions. We grieve with their families and their friends and with the families of all the coalition forces and civilians who made the ultimate sacrifice in these noble endeavors. Our armed forces remain committed to winning the global war on terrorism and combating the spread of weapons of mass destruction, while at the same time enhancing our warfighting capabilities and transforming to meet the challenges of the 21st century. We are capable of executing our national military strategy despite these considerable challenges. Today, over 2.2 million service members serve in the total force. Many are deployed in countries around the world or at sea. Throughout the world, U.S. forces provide stability, peacekeeping, humanitarian assistance, and hope, ultimately aiding in the global war on terrorism. We and our partners have captured and killed many of al-Qaeda's senior leaders and hurt their ability to conduct operations, but they are still a very real and global threat. They continue to murder innocent men, women, and children, and terrorist leaders such as bin Laden, Zawahiri, and al-Zakari openly encourage Muslims to kill Americans and our allies. We will continue to hunt them down. Though our accomplishments are considerable, the U.S. military cannot win this war alone. Success requires cooperating with multinational partners, as the Secretary said, and integrating military capabilities across the U.S. interagency to harness all elements of national power. While I believe the various agencies of our government have learned to work together in new and better ways, we need to become still more efficient and effective in integrating the efforts of various government agencies. In Iraq, the U.S. is committed to helping the Iraqis build a secure and peaceful future with a representative government based upon the rule of law. The key to success is to help the Iraqis be more self-reliant. A timetable for leaving Iraq would be counterproductive, leaving the terrorists to think they can wait us out. The Iraqi people are assuming greater and greater roles in providing for their own security. The recent Iraqi elections showed their courage and determination to support a free and democratic country and represented a moral defeat for the insurgents. Iraqis have a renewed pride of ownership in their government and in their future. The list of accomplishments in Iraq in every sector is impressive and continually growing. The plan is on track. Less than 2 years ago, coalition forces defeated a brutal dictator and his regime, established a provisional authority to get Iraq, along with its dilapidated infrastructure, back on its feet. And last summer, we transferred sovereignty to an interim government. On January 30th, as we all know, Iraqis elected a transitional National Assembly. This assembly will appoint a presidency council to select the prime minister, who will select a cabinet. This assembly will also draft a new constitution for referendum in October. A really amazing accomplishment for people oppressed for over a generation. And as they face the challenges that remain, the coalition will stand firmly beside the Iraqi people to sustain momentum and progress in helping Iraqi security forces defeat the insurgents. Again, this must be an international and interagency effort. We must avoid making the coalition military presence a unifying element for the insurgents. The objective must be to shift from providing security through coalition counterinsurgency operations to building Iraqi capability to operate independently. The plan for Afghanistan is on track as well. The October 2004 presidential election in Afghanistan was a historic moment, conducted under the protection of their own national army and police forces with the assistance of coalition and international security assistance force. These elections represented a real and moral defeat to the insurgency and provided new momentum for reform efforts. National Assembly elections are currently scheduled for this summer. Congress's firm commitment is leading the international effort to fund and equip reconstruction in Afghanistan. Now numbering approximately 19,000 personnel, the Afghan National Army is a multi-ethnic, visible symbol of national pride, unity, and strength. The coalition and NATO will continue to help build the commands and institutions the Afghans need to sustain and manage their military. At the same time, we must stay focused on the enormous global threat posed by the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, particularly in North Korea and Iran's ongoing nuclear weapons-related activities. Most troubling is the terrorists' stated desire and intent to acquire weapons of mass destruction. We will continue to work with the international community to expand counterproliferation activities. And despite the current operational demands on our forces, we are fully prepared to support our strategy to assure our allies while we dissuade, deter, and, if required, defeat any adversary. Our forces are the world's most capable, in large part because they're the best equipped and best trained. But our nation's #1 military asset has always been and remains the brave men and women serving in our armed forces. The administration, Congress, and the Department of Defense have made raising our service members' standards of living a top priority. And I thank Congress for your tremendous support to our troops and to our families. As the Secretary said, current stresses on the force are significant and will remain so in the near future. I am particularly concerned with the wear and tear on our equipment, especially our vehicles. The current operational tempo and harsh environmental conditions are accelerating the wear on our equipment, placing a huge demand on maintenance, supply, depot repair, and production. In the face of continuing demands on our forces, we are analyzing all our policies and making changes to mitigate readiness challenges. Congressional support, both in the annual budget and supplemental funding, has been essential for continued operations, for Army modularization, and for recapitalization. As you know, we continue to rely heavily on our reserve and guard personnel. Our reserve components are serving critical roles around the world, and as part of the total force, the reserves also serve as an important link to the American people. Morale in both the active and reserve component remains high, and the support of the American people has never been better. However, we must continue to review and update our mobilization processes. I look forward to working with the new Congressional Commission on Guard and Reserve Matters to chart the future course for our very important reserve component. I anticipate that fiscal year 05 will be a very challenging year for both active and reserve component recruiting, particularly for the Army Reserve components. We are increasing the numbers of recruiters and restructuring enlistment bonuses to help mitigate these challenges. As the Secretary said, protecting our troops remains a top priority. We have an aggressive project to focus on rapidly developing systems to detect and counter improvised explosive devices, and the rapid production and distribution of interceptor body armor to our forces in both Iraq and Afghanistan was a tremendous success. And clearly as essential as providing body armor for our troops is providing armored vehicles to transport them. And we're making good progress ensuring that no soldier, with a few exceptions, leaves an Iraqi forward operating base in vehicles without protection. We have also doubled the number of direct air delivery hubs in Iraq and expanded intra-theater airlift to reduce the number of convoys in high-risk zones. I'm really proud of all our transformational efforts and successes. And we must continue to invest heavily in transformation, both intellectually and materially, to meet the challenges facing our country today and in the future. This year, we will work through 3 major processes that will have a far-reaching impact on our future force posture. The first is the 2005 Quadrennial Defense Review, which will provide a comprehensive strategic plan for transforming the armed forces. The next is the base realignment and closure process, which provides an excellent opportunity to further transform our warfighting capability and eliminate excess capacity. And third, our global basing strategy transforms the Cold War footprint into one focused on capabilities, combining CONUS-based rotational forces that are lean and agile with strategically placed overseas-based forces. The transformational decisions that we make today will have a lasting impact on our nation's defense capabilities and those of our allies and our partners. We must make thoughtful, informed choices about systems and programs that may be new and improved, but not sufficient for our dynamic security environment. The Joint Chiefs of Staff fully understand this and are leading our armed forces to transform. We are now in our 4th year of sustained combat operations, and we are still a nation at war. Our servicemen and women continue to perform superbly under conditions of significant stress and in the face of a myriad of challenges. They stand ready to protect the United States, prevent conflict and surprise attack, and prevail against adversaries. I am, as I know you are, tremendously proud of them. This is a pivotal moment in our nation's history and in world history. We must stay committed if we are to win the global war on terrorism and extremism. We can't be defeated militarily, but the terrorists can win if we lose our resolve, and they know it. Our military is unwavering in our focus, in our resolve, and our dedication to peace and freedom. But we can't do it alone. We need your leadership, your continued leadership, to reinforce America's resolve. In my view, our way of life is indeed at stake, and we're entering a crucial stage of this long struggle. The price for complacency would be catastrophic. The reward for our perseverance will be freedom. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, General, and thank you for your service to our nation. And the chair will reserve time until the end of the hearing, and we'll move to Mr. Skelton. The gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General, you're absolutely right. This is a pivotal moment in history. We have to get it right. By a briefing I had yesterday, things are well on the right track, especially with NATO help in Afghanistan. I think people should know that. The system works, Mr. Secretary. We in Congress are part of that system under the Constitution, other laws, setting forth our duties and responsibilities. And a recent law requires that a document known as the National Military Strategy be prepared by General Myers and delivered to your office. That was to have been delivered to us on February 15th of last year. It might be outdated by today. I don't know. And I refer, Mr. Secretary, to your comment, and it's correct. The struggle cannot be won by military means alone. But in absence of the strategic document, I must ask you, what is our strategy for ensuring that the Iraqi government can provide for its own security, that we consolidate our political gains, that economic reconstruction steps be brought together, And what are the metrics for success? In other words, what is the strategy to win? We must win there. What is our strategy? Would you tell us, Mr. Secretary?
Congressman Skelton, first let me say that the documents you're referring to, I believe, should be sent up very soon, I think next month. Isn't that correct?
Yes, sir.
With respect to the Iraq situation, the answer to your question is that it will be the Iraqi people that defeat that insurgency. It will be the Iraqi people that provide for their country reconstruction. They've got great wealth with water and oil. They have intelligent people, well-educated people, and they have every opportunity to make a success of it, and it will be their task to do that. Our circumstance and our requirement is to try to, first of all, the coalition forces liberated those people and freed them from a vicious dictatorship. You mentioned the success of the election, and of course that's true. I must say there were an awful lot of people who wanted to put off the election and delay it, and thanks to the steely perseverance of the President Bush, it went forward and it was successful. The work that's being done and has been done since March or April or May of 2003 with respect to training up the Iraqi security forces, I don't know if we have a chart on that or not, but as I said in my remarks, we've gone from 0 to 136,000. We're scheduled to have 200,000 in September or October of this year when the elections take place with respect to the Constitution. And in December, between December and January, we should have 230,000 for the second elections, which are the elections of the people under the new Constitution. And the program takes it to 270,000 by June of 06. I expect to see the coalition countries begin paring down their forces as they complete their contributions. And depending on the nature of the insurgency, the Iraqi forces obviously will become increasingly capable of managing the security for the Iraqi people. I think that you will see over the coming weeks and months a modest refocusing of U.S. efforts towards increasing the mentoring and training and assisting of the Iraqi forces as the Iraqi forces take over more and more responsibility for the security in the country. As you know, the President said from the outset, we have no desire to be in Iraq. We have no desire to maintain forces there any longer than is absolutely necessary. And the goal is to get that country on a path to democracy, and certainly this election was a wonderful first step. I must say one other thing about it. People were worried that the Shia, after the election, would get even, if you will. The Sunnis ran the country for 35 years with a 20% population of the population. And everything I've seen is just to the contrary. The Shia, who got most votes, are reaching out to the Sunnis. They're including them. They recognize the importance of having all elements of the country participate in drafting the Constitution, and I think that's an encouraging thing.
Mr. Secretary.
May I add, Congressman Skelton, may I add one thing? I think we have a chart on the strategic tasks and objectives for Iraq that comes out of our national strategy, if you could put that up. But in fact, the strategy is very well developed. As you know, the State Department just conducted an assessment in Iraq to determine if that strategy was any adjustments were needed. Those are the strategic objectives that we track. We have metrics for many of those lines of operation. We have goals, and we continue to update those and refine those as time go on. And in fact, we have a room in the Pentagon where we track the metrics for the strategic task to be achieved, and we'd be happy to show it to members if you're so inclined to come over to the Pentagon and see how we track progress.
Mr. Chairman, an additional question. In regard, as we all know, of course, American troops are still paying a deadly price. I hate to turn the radio on in the morning and listen to those reports. So may I ask, what is our current estimate of the size of the insurgent force? And how much uncertainty is connected with that estimate? Mr. Secretary.
The intelligence community looks at that. CIA does, DIA does, others do, and they have differing assessments at different times. And as you know, they're made up of former regime elements, Ba'athis, and they're made up of Zarqawi-type jihadists and terrorists, and they also include a varying number of criminals who are paid to do these things. And it's that aggregation that it constitutes the insurgents. I am not going to give you a number for it because it's not my business to do intelligent work. Maybe, Dick, you want to comment on it?
Well, I think your description is right. The insurgents, the primary insurgents that we need to be concerned with, there are two types. One is the Al-Qaeda associated Zarqawi folks in country and the foreign fighters. We think that is a fairly small percentage of the total number of insurgents. And then we have the former regime elements and Sunni extremists that are hardcore. The hardcore, the ones that need to be captured or dealt with on the battlefield, is a smaller percentage of the overall total, which includes folks like common criminals, and it includes folks that are opportunistic and perhaps because they don't have a job are willing to take money to attack the coalition, or are dissatisfied because they don't see a political future for themselves or their families or their tribes. So the number is, like all insurgencies, very hard to measure. These are generally small cells. They don't keep very good records as we capture individuals. You can't simply go into their paraphernalia and say, aha, here's their organizational diagram, because they don't have one. So the estimates are hard to come by. If you look at capabilities, and Congressman Skelton used the chart to show the attacks over time, we think we have a pretty good idea of what their capabilities are, and outside of Fallujah, they have not used conventional military tactics to attack either Iraqis or ourselves. They use terrorism, they use extremism, they use beheadings. And that's probably the level of their capability, despite what the numbers might be. And the way you defeat that, as in all insurgencies, is not with numbers. Numbers aren't as important as good governance in Iraq, good economic conditions and infrastructure in Iraq, a good communications policy in Iraq that communicates with the internally to the Iraqi people.
Let me point out very quickly that the intelligence service director of the Iraqi intelligence says that there are 40,000 hardcore fighters and more than 200,000 part-time fighters. That's the only number that I have in front of me. Do you agree or disagree with his assessment?
Who is that?
His name is General Mohammed Abdullah Shawani.
Oh, I've seen that. I've got two in front of me that are different, one from CIA and one from DIA, so it's...
Would you share those with us?
Pardon me?
Could you share those with us?
I'd be happy to. They're classified.
Yeah.
Well, all right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
But they're considerably different than that number and considerably lower.
I thank the gentleman, it was the chair's prerogative to give more time to the ranking member, but we are going to adhere to this 5-minute rule. I'd say to questioners and questionees. So let me go to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Weldon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank each of you for coming in for your service to the country. Mr. Secretary, I couldn't be prouder of our troops and the leadership of the job that they've done, and I applaud you for the effort in general. Having visited the region and seen our troops and talked to them, their morale is high, and we're here to support and continue to support the kinds of resources that you need. And this year's defense authorization markup will give you that support. I'm not going to talk about Iraq. We have a members briefing this afternoon where I'll be asking some Iraqi questions, but I do want to bring two specific congressional initiatives to your attention. Mr. Secretary, I'd ask for your support for each of them. The first is an effort, and you both mentioned the control of proliferation as a major priority, and I agree with that, especially with weapons of mass destruction coming out of the former Soviet Union. And the first gets at the heart of cooperation with the Russians in two areas. One is to move forward with a new effort in joint missile defense cooperation. As you know, General Kadish canceled the only cooperative program we have with the Russians, called RAMOS. There is no follow-on program. At his suggestion, last May, I took General Obering over to Moscow because we were not able to get a proper meeting with General Baluyevsky. We had that meeting, and the Missile Defense Agency was ready to sign a contract to move forward with missile defense cooperation, both for targeting and for the use of their radars. The policy shop weighed in and wanted to review the team that was being dealt with, and General Baluyevsky had been then elevated to the Chief of the General Staff. Right now on Doug Fife's desk, and he's been very cooperative in this effort, there's an assessment being done of working with a new group that reports directly to Putin on cooperation in both missile defense and in getting access to 39 of the most sensitive biological sites in Russia to do joint research and applications work. Some of these sites have never been made available to us before. So I would just ask you to get a briefing from Undersecretary Fife. Let him know that, as I briefed you and Secretary Wolfowitz a year ago, that this is an effort that we should pursue aggressively, because the end result is to get better access from the Russians on their biological sites, as well as cooperation with them on missile defense. The group that the Russians have organized is called the International Exchange Group, but they will be coming over here in the next 2 months, and they report directly to Putin. The second issue deals with nuclear policy and the posture review. As I've talked to you, Mr. Secretary, repeatedly, members and the public don't fully understand all the time the implications of the use of nuclear weapons in the 21st century. And the best evidence of that lack of understanding was the rejection by the Congress of various aspects of your requests last year, specifically for the RNEP. I can tell you, having led a delegation in North Korea 1 month ago with 3 of my Democrat colleagues from this committee and 2 Republicans from this committee, the North Koreans were very intrigued by the notion that we were looking to pursue a deep earth penetrator to get at their underground complexes. We told them it lost by 1 vote. And I would suggest to you, Mr. Secretary, that we ought to pursue the creation that we recommended last year of a nuclear posture commission. It's now a nonprofit organization that could provide consultation to the Congress and to the American people about the role of nuclear weapons as a part of our nuclear posture in the 21st century. If that commission were in fact in place, perhaps we wouldn't have had the kind of actions that led to the defeat of the RNEP by 1 vote in the last session of Congress. And so I would ask you to relook at that whole commission and the current activities of the Nuclear Strategy Forum, which is being co-chaired by Johnny Foster and Keith Payne. These tools are designed to help you in your effort at dealing with the use of nuclear weapons in the 21st century and the understanding of them by the Congress and by the people, and in the area of proliferation to help you get at the sources of those weapons of mass destruction technology that largely lie in the former Soviet states. So I would just make those 2 comments. I do have a more detailed question about the posture review, and with the Chairman's indulgence, I will add that into the record and ask you to respond to the actual specifics of the question in more detail. Thank you.
Congressman, I'd be happy to get the briefing you suggested. As you know, we have about $415 million in the budget for cooperative threat reduction, and we've spent up to $25 or $30 million for Ramos in 2004. And we have gone back in the budget for the robust nuclear earth penetrator study. And if you think about it, the new technology enables anyone in the world to buy dual-use technology and dig underground in rock, twice the height of a basketball net and the full length of a basketball court every day in rock. And it's available to anybody. And countries all across the globe are putting things underground. And we have no capability, conventional or nuclear, to deal with the issue of deep penetrator.
I thank the gentleman. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Ortiz.
Mr. Secretary, Mr. Chairman, welcome to our committee today. I was looking at the chart that you have there. Neutralize the insurgents, ensure legitimate elections, and so on down the line. To do that, how long will it take us to get there?
Oh, I'd be happy to start, and maybe General Myers wants to comment. There's never been a war that was predictable as to length, casualty, or cost in the history of mankind. Anyone who attempts to do it is, within a relatively short order, proven to be not quite as wise as they thought they were. You say, how long will it take? The goal is to have the Iraqis have the security capability to manage their own insurgency. We can predict how long it will take. We can predict how long it will take to train up and equip various types of forces. And we have materials we send up to the committee weekly that explain all of that and show all the types of forces and the numbers and what the projection is. The question is, how does that capability match with the actual problem of the insurgency? Is the insurgency going to grow or decline? General Myers pointed out that the nature of the insurgency is dependent not simply upon the security forces to deal with it, but also on the political progress and the economic progress, and both of those are making headway. So that ought to be encouraging, but I regret, I'd dearly love to be able to give you a specific date. I can't.
The reason I'm asking is also because I think he had breakfast Saturday with General Casey, and he mentioned about the idea of embedding 2,000 to 3,000 soldiers training to train the Iraqis. Is this safe to do that, since we see every day where they attack National Guardsmen, where they attack police officers? How safe would that move be?
I don't believe it will happen with respect to police forces. And you're quite right, that would be an issue. Second, I would say that we're already doing it in a number of parts of the country, and it's proven to be, you know, what it has been. The reason I mention that is because we tend to think of Iraq as a single homogeneous circumstance, and it isn't. It's quite different. Of the 18 provinces, 14 have relatively low number of incidents a day. Of the remaining 4, one of which is Baghdad, and of the 4, they constitute something like 40% of the population. So it's a higher percentage of the population than it is the provinces. But that is where the bulk of the violence is. And so General Casey and the commanders on the ground will be the ones that will have to make those judgments about safety.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, sir.
I thank the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Heffley.
Mr. Secretary, I continue to be concerned about what seems to be a cultural phenomenon that's grown up in the last few years of putting repeated expenses in the supplemental. And I understand what you spoke to this, and I understand what you're saying about need to change quickly and so forth. But there are certain aspects of the war effort that we pretty much know what it is, what it's going to be. We spend $4.1 billion a month on O&M in Iraq, and we can predict that almost every month, that's what it's going to be. I mean, it's amazingly consistent. We spend $0.8 billion a month in Afghanistan, and again, amazingly consistent. So I'm wondering, now this doesn't include the cost of personnel, but that's fairly consistent, I would think. But so I wonder why these aspects can't be put in the normal budget. We still need the flexibility of the supplemental for certain things that we don't anticipate. But the thing that disturbs me, Mr. Secretary, is that we will tell you, oh, we're going to scrub that supplemental. We're going to really look at that supplemental. But when the supplemental comes to it, the reaction is, pretty much, well, if the troops need it, we got to do it. And so we don't really scrub it very well. And it goes through, and I wonder if that's the purpose of doing it in supplemental, so that it doesn't get scrubbed so thoroughly. We spend endless hours and many, many hearings looking at your normal budget requests. And the supplemental, $81 billion goes through. So can you respond to this? Couldn't we put most of what we're talking about in war costs, because they are repeating now, into the normal budget request?
Congressman, I am no expert on this subject, and I've asked the same kinds of questions and as you understand, it's basically a decision that's made between Congress and the Office of Management and Budget in the executive branch, not the departments. I'm told that the Congressional Budget Resolution of 2005, emergency spending is allowed for supplemental when the spending is designated an emergency by the President or the Congress, when spending is necessary, essential, or vital, urgent, pressing, compelling, unforeseen, unpredictable, or unanticipated, not permanent, and temporary in nature. Now, you're right. You do have a monthly figure that's been fairly steady in Afghanistan. Our hope, obviously, is to be able to pare those troops down. We don't know after they have the parliamentary elections this summer, and if President Karzai continues to have success, our hope is to be able to make some modest changes in those, in the coalition. The same thing in Iraq. We can't predict how long it will go on. So even though the number's been steady, it's hard. And if you go back to that chart we had that shows that the regular budget cycle's 33, 34, 35 months. That is a long time. Let me give you an example of the dilemma I had. I told our military, I said, when you come back to reset the force, after you've been in Afghanistan and Iraq, do not come back and reset the force the way it was. Reset the force the way it ought to be. So if you go over to a war and you end up using dumb bombs up, you don't want to come back and buy more dumb bombs and replenish your supply of antiquated weaponry. You want to buy smart bombs. And the question is that a replenishment and a reset that goes in a sup or a supplemental, or is it something else? Is it an improvement? Well, it's both. And the same thing on Army modularity. We have the same dilemma you do, and I don't know the answer, but we've sure tried to do the best we could, and I think it's much better to have our forces reset for the future rather than the past. So trying to disaggregate which portion of that, there's no way we could have put it into a regular budget. We would have had to start 32 months ago.
Well, thank you, Mr. Secretary. It is it's frustrating, I think, to all of us, and I can see that it is to you as well. And maybe we have some responsibility to give you guidance in what we will accept and what we won't accept in a supplemental. And, Mr. Chairman, maybe we ought to do more talk about that at the committee level and see. But thank you very much.
Thank you.
I thank the gentleman, and and probably in Army modularity is probably one of the areas we need to look at, because that is to a large degree a predictable thing. But certainly this is a major issue for us, but one that attends, I think, the wartime circumstances. The gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Taylor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Secretary and General Myers, for being here. Mr. Secretary, I listened with great interest to your remarks that the system works. As someone who represents the state of Mississippi, a state that has now lost 4 National Guardsmen in the past 12 days, I would counter by saying your system doesn't work fast enough. Its first was with the body armor. If you recall, the initial story was that only the active duty force needed the best body armor, that the Guardsmen and Reservists didn't need it because they were not on the front line. Didn't take the bad guys very long to figure out that there was no front line. If you shot a Guardsman, you probably killed him. If you hit a guy in the 82nd, he probably lived. That took way too long to fix. Second problem was with the armored Humvees. I know for a fact, speaking to my colleague Mr. Simmons, that you had delivered a letter a year ago, October of '03, on the need for armoring all of the Humvees. I know that our chairman brought it to your attention about a year ago, January. I brought it to your attention a year ago, January. And yet it took a Tennessee National Guardsman last December to remind you that the problem wasn't getting fixed. As a matter of curiosity, I went to our Rock Island Arsenal 2 days after that conversation. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, there were 3 blue-collar workers working in this enormous facility. 2 cutting steel, 1 welding. I was told that the capacity for Rock Island was 1,000 a week, and yet they were only making 200 a week. Now, there were several things along the way that they're told didn't happen, that the suppliers had put them back on the list, and the question becomes, Why isn't the Secretary calling the suppliers and making them aware of this? That there were issues with funding, that they didn't know that the money was coming. My goodness, they didn't know the money was coming. We sure allocated it. And then I'll follow it up with the third mistake, with jammers. There is the technology to prevent the detonation of most improvised explosive devices. It exists, and we've allocated the money for it. And yet that number remains classified, Mr. Secretary, not because the insurgents don't know how few are protected, but because I'm of the opinion the American people would be appalled if they knew how few are protected. I'll contrast that, Mr. Secretary, with a tape I wish I could have shown today of the water palace in Iraq. First time I went a year ago, September, the place looked like it had been bombed. When I went back in January, it once again looks like a palace. Our nation has spent about $12 million restoring that palace. My question is, if there's a sense of urgency to repair palaces, why can't we get that sense of urgency on armoring vehicles? Why can't we get that sense of urgency on buying improvised explosive device jammers? Why can't we have that sense of urgency when it comes to the average GI on the street? And Mr. Secretary, again, you are the Secretary of Defense. I applaud the chairman for sending one of his staffers to actually make the phone calls to the steel mills and tell them the importance that those materials were going to armor Humvees and save kids' lives. Why weren't you doing that? Why weren't you calling Rock Island and saying, guys, if you can make 1,000 a week, why don't you make 1,000 a week? We can't solve this problem too quickly. And in the case of the jammers, I still think you have way too few. As I just got off the phone with our Adjutant General from Mississippi, yes, the convoys are protected, but when you send a response team out on short notice, the chances are they're not protected. And those Mississippians who died in the past 2 weeks did not have 1 day of training with jammers for improvised explosive devices before they got in theater, neither at Camp Shelby in Mississippi or at the National Training Center. And the answer that I was given was, well, we can't train with them because we don't have enough of them. Well, heck, if you don't have enough of them, buy them. Tell us what the bill is, we'll pay it. Mr. Secretary, I would very much appreciate a response to that.
As you can see on the chart that I presented earlier on up-armored Humvees.
Mr. Secretary, that took a year. Where's the sense of urgency?
Could I finish my answer,
Certainly.
please? You just said that it took a Tennessee Guardsman in December of '04 for the Department of Defense to do something. If you look where December of '04 is, the department had been working well before anyone raised it in that meeting. So your statement is
No, Mr. Secretary,
not correct.
you were working aggressively, and for some unexplained reason in the fall of '04, you went from doing 1,000 a week down to a couple of hundred a week, and the need was not fulfilled yet.
If you look at the chart, it shows what the total up-armored Humvees in Iraq were during that period, and it began very aggressively shortly after the need arose when the commander on the ground saw the use of the improvised devices to the extent they were being used, and the ramp-up began very aggressively during that period. I would say what all of us here know, there isn't a life that's lost over there that isn't heartbreaking and deeply felt by all of the people in the Department of Defense. And I think, however, to suggest that there's been anything other than a department-wide effort would not be an accurate representation.
Mr. Secretary, it is an accurate representation.
The same thing is true with respect to body armor. Do you want to mention the Rock Island arsenal issue?
My understanding is, Congressman Taylor, that the Army talked to you yesterday about the Rock Island business. I don't know if it satisfied your question or not. It's new. It's new to me. I have the answer they provided, which is that Rock Island is one of 7 sites, and they were transitioning between Humvee kits to truck kits and fuel trucks, I think, to be specific. So, other than that, I have a chart. Can you put the chart up on total?
If I may, did either of you gentlemen tour the Rock Island Arsenal?
I haven't toured it,
At any
no.
time.
Let me put up the chart, please, on total number of armored vehicles. Because we often talk about the up-armored Humvee, Put the one that has the total number of armored vehicles. It's
General Myers, appreciate the...
There it is right there, right there. Put that chart right there. You got a hand on it, right hand. Yeah, put that up there on the chart.
General Myers, I understand the importance of this question, but I want to remind my colleagues and my
Yes,
panel
sir.
that
I'm just going to finish this, sir.
we've taken 5 minutes, so if
10
you can
seconds.
wrap it pretty
Let me just show you
quickly.
in 10 seconds that if you look at the total number of vehicles in Iraq, over 35,000, 28,000 today are armored. As the Secretary said, with a few exceptions that we can explain to you offline, nobody off installations in Iraq without being in some armor protection, and then by summer of '03, all the level 3, which is the lowest level, will be replaced by level 2 armor protection. So this has been an imperative and one that's received a lot of attention here in the last year and a half, as the requirements continue to grow, by the way. They didn't start out at 35,000. They've grown over time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you, and just say to my colleague, I know this is an important area, and I look forward to continuing to work this with him, and maybe we can ask questions at the end of this thing. Let me go to the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Saxton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary General, thank you for the great job that you've been doing, and we all appreciate it. And Secretary Jonas, thank you for joining the team. I know what a tough job you have, because I know your predecessor very well, and I think we wore him out, so we don't want to wear you out. I have a C-17 question I'd like to ask, but I got to say first that I have a little different view of the Humvee situation and the body armor situation than some of my colleagues do. You know, when we got ready to go to Operation Iraqi Freedom, we had a set of expectations about what we were going to face. Some of them came true, and some of them were quite different than what we anticipated. And I've got to say that had I been in your position, making decisions about how to up armor, how to get it done quickly, how to produce body armor faster, and all the things that we had to do to meet the threat that was so different than what may have been anticipated by us or those who were making plans for these kind of eventualities. These were tough. This is a tough decision, a set of tough decisions that had to be made, and about how to move forward quickly. And quite frankly, while everything that we did wasn't perfect, I think we did a remarkable job in providing the material and the armor for our soldiers. All of us had the same set of goals, and we got there. Maybe some people would have been able to do it differently, but I'm glad that we were able to progress as quickly as we could. Let me ask my C-17 question, if I may. Whatever the fight is like, we've got to get there, and we've got to get there. The quicker we get there, as we all know from history, the better off our fighters are, the better off our planners are, and the more chance we have of success. We're going to finish our C-17 buy. I've forgotten exactly what the year is. I guess in '08 we'll get the last model get the last airplane off the line, and we've got to make a decision about whether to go forward. Part of that decision, of course, is being considered by the mobility requirement study that's due to come out in a few months. But General Myers, if I could just get your opinion as to where we are with regard to this subject, and what your thoughts are about moving forward.
Well, first of all, as you said, the C-17 has proven to be a terrific asset, particularly given the distances that this country's had to move people and material. It's been invaluable. As you mentioned, we have the mobility capability study that will complete in March, and we have the quadrennial defense review. And between those two vehicles, I think we'll have a chance to determine what the overall mobility requirement is, not just C-17s, not just inter-theater airlift, but intra-theater airlift as well, the role that shipping plays and other modes of transportation. So it'll be a comprehensive study. I think when that is finished, we'll know what to recommend in terms of the final number of C-17s, but I don't think anybody right now, without those studies being completed, are ready to make a prediction.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Meehan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary General Myers. I want to reiterate Mr. Skelton's concern about the administration's failure to lay out a concrete strategy to achieve these objectives that have been outlined, and I think we all agree with them, and also to win the peace in Iraq. It's been nearly 2 years since we invaded Iraq and removed Saddam Hussein from power, but our troops are clearly facing a more resilient enemy. There are sections of Iraq that have plunged into violence and chaos, and I think as members of this committee we must ask ourselves, how can we help put the United States on a path towards self-sufficiency and begin to bring our troops home in a way that advances our strategic interest? And what is the responsibility in Congress in helping shape Iraq policy? Is it simply writing a check, or is it to debate this policy? I think the answer begins by verifying to the American people and the Iraqi people that we don't intend to maintain a permanent military presence in Iraq. And I'm worried, Mr. Secretary, that the supplemental budget request sends a mixed signal to the Iraqi people about our long-term intentions in Iraq. The Defense Department has asked for $560 million for military construction projects to be available to be spent in Iraq through fiscal year 2009. Last week, Secretary Harvey testified before the committee that the United States has no intention of keeping a military presence in Iraq. But I wonder what kind of a signal we're sending to the Iraqi people and to the American taxpayers if we're spending hundreds of millions on military construction projects. And I'm curious whether the Iraqi government has approved this construction, and recognize the fact we just had an election, but there has been an Iraqi government in place. Is there an agreement to turn over these bases to the Iraqis now that they're in the process of having elected government in place? And what kind of basing agreements are we seeking next year and then the year after that, I guess going right to fiscal 2009? Have we entered into negotiating any kind of a basing agreements with either the prior Iraqi government or the new Iraqi government, and how are we going to work out some of these concerns logistically?
Well, Congressman, you have it correct that the United States has a public policy of wanting to be there as long as we're needed and not one day longer. The investments that are being proposed in the supplemental, as I recall, are for facilities that will be somewhat safer for our forces while they're there. Some are for hospitals, some are to improve airfields, and some are to improve billeting. But I don't believe any of it could be characterized as permanent, and I would not want it to be so characterized. With respect to the negotiations and discussions with the Iraqi government, we consult very closely with them. Our forces do, and our embassy now does. And they are certainly aware of what it is we're doing. Precisely what would happen to facilities when we depart, I think, is something to be discussed and managed as we go forward. One of the things we're going to have to do this year, between now and when the Constitution is completed and the permanent government is elected in December, is to begin that process of inventorying all of those questions like status of forces agreement, bases. We want to move all of the Iraqi prisoners of war over to the Iraqis so that they're the ones taking care of them, turn over those the detention centers to them, for example. And these are all things that are being worked on now with the Department of State, the Department of Defense, and the Iraqi government. However, the Iraqi situation is in kind of a mid-period right now. The current government exists and has all authority until the Transitional Assembly is seated, the people that were just elected. And then they, of course, select the Prime Minister, the President, the Deputy Presidents. And then they will only be there during the period when the Constitution is being developed, and then they will be replaced in January with a permanent government. So our discussions and negotiations with respect to those issues are unlikely to be taking place in this interregnum, but very likely will start shortly with the new government once it's announced in 2, 3, 4 weeks, whatever it may be.
Okay, so, and you couldn't comment specifically on what kind of basing agreements we're going to seek. We'll just have to see how that goes. And the other quick comment I'd make, you can't help but go to Iraq and see the concrete being poured and not get a sense that, that we intend a little more of a permanent presence. And that's why I think it's important for the Congress to stay on top of this and to work with the administration.
I tell the gentleman, Mr. Reyes is making cutoff signs here for you, Mr. Meehan. Well, your head is turned there. But if we've got a lot of folks we got to get to, and if you can ask, maybe ask any follow-up questions in writing, that would be appreciated. Appreciate the gentleman. The gentleman from New York, Mr. McHugh.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Rumsfeld, General Myers, welcome. Secretary Jonas, welcome. We look forward to working with you and wish you all the best, of course, in your new position. General Myers, you mentioned in your statement, written statement, that you are supportive of improving survivor death benefits for the military. I think that's probably a sentiment that is shared by most, if not all, the people in this room and far beyond the doors of this chamber. Secretary Chu has joined you there, has testified that while the Department of Defense is supportive, he's indicated that should only be related for combat-related deaths. The vice chiefs have broadened their support and have said for all deaths with respect to, regardless of the circumstances. I was curious what your position is on that. Only combat-related deaths and illnesses, or a broader-based death benefit?
My personal opinion is that it probably should be more broadly based. And part of that is based on, you know, what you think is right. There also may be some legal issues with specifying a certain group, and we have to look into those. So I think that whole issue of survivor benefits needs a very good scrub by the Congress and by the Department to work together to come up with a package that is appropriate for our men and women in service.
Thank you. Mr. Secretary, the supplemental contains money. Commend the President for that. The language focuses, if I'm reading it correctly, focuses that benefit on combat-related deaths and illnesses, but there appears to be some flexibility for you to expand that. Now, obviously, expansion costs money. We all understand that. But I was just curious if you've had a chance to flesh out in your mind how you think that that benefit should be applied.
My recollection is that there's $400 million in the budget, the SUP, and that it's a matter that's under discussion between the executive branch and the legislative branch in the House and the Senate, and whatever comes out from that process clearly we'll find funds to fund. We just have to.
But you yourself have not taken a position.
As a presidential appointee, I tend to support the president, and my guess is that he and the executive branch will be in discussions with the Senate and the House on the subject and end up with an agreement that's it certainly needs to be raised. It certainly has to be appropriate for the families that have lost loved ones, and needless to say, I'm very much in support of that.
Okay, gentlemen, thank you. Secretary General Myers also talks in his written statement about the reserve challenge of reserve recruiting, and indicated that 5 of the 6 reserve components did not achieve their recruiting goals for through January of this year, and it's going to be a tough year through 2005. I think we all understand that for recruiting, but the statement goes on to say that in meeting the challenge, a variety of things are being done, including increasing the number of recruiters and restructuring and enlistment bonuses. But if you look at the budget data, there is some growth in spending for active Army, active Air Force, the Army National Guard, and the Air National Guard, but I would describe those ladders, particularly for the Army Reserve, as flat or reduced. In fact, the Army Reserve would receive a decrease from 90 million down to 88 million. So I guess we can make a question out of this, but really my intent is to express a concern that I have in previous years that there's a lag time, as you know, General and Mr. Secretary, between the time you dedicate those recruiting dollars and you actually reap the benefits. And I think we've got to do a lot better job in maintaining a higher level and a more consistent level in the recruiting and retention field. There's a tendency that when the numbers are good, we cut the allocations. I understand we have needs elsewhere. And we eventually pay the price, and I don't think this is the time we want to do that. So if you want to treat that as a question, fine. It was really an unpaid
Well, I think you focused in the last part of your question on the component that we're most worried about, and that would be the Army Reserve. And we just need to, that's something the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Secretary, his staff, Dr. Chu, we worry about this all the time. One of our big issues, of course, is looking around corners at people's intentions, and it's hard to predict that. So we've got to lead it as much as we can, and we'll review the budget figures, but that's how we're going to mitigate that with more recruiters and retention bonuses and so forth.
I appreciate the gentleman. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Reyes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Secretary and General, thank you for being here with us this morning. I have a question for each one of you, but the first one, Mr. Secretary, deals with what I think fits in the category where the system does not work. And it concerns the U.S. pilots that filed a lawsuit, as this was reported in the L.A. Times on the 15th of this month, where they filed a lawsuit against Iraq for compensation. They won their case, were awarded, and now the administration is taking a position that this should be dismissed. The irony, there are a couple of ironies. One of them is that some of these pilots were tortured in the same Abu Ghraib prison where prisoners were abused by our troops. And the article quotes that, Mr. Secretary, you're in favor of awarding compensation to Iraqi prisoners who were abused by U.S. military at this prison, and at the same time, our own pilots that have won a court case are now being denied the same kind of compensation. I was wondering, do you have any comment on that?
Congressman, I don't. It's a matter that the Department of Justice handles for the United States government, not something the Department of Defense does.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. General Meyer, when we're talking about the plan for providing Iraqi forces and their capabilities to be self-sufficient, it is my understanding that right now the U.S. provides all combat support and combat service support to the Iraqis. So my question is, given the charts that you've provided us here this morning, when do you think that the Iraqis will be self-sufficient to provide for themselves, both in combat support and combat service support on their own? When will they be able to stand on their own completely? And is there a plan to have them do that?
Absolutely. As was pointed out by General Petraeus and General Casey, and by General Luck when he came back with his observations, clearly one of the things that has to happen is that before those capabilities are developed in the Iraqi forces, we've got to support them with what we call the enablers, but to help them with command and control, to help them with communications, to help them with intelligence and their processes, and logistics support, as you mentioned. But over time, they've got to become self-reliant. So that's one of the pieces that General Petraeus is working and General Casey are working. They have to be self-reliant and be able to take care of themselves. And so that's part of the planning that's going forward. As you know, or may know, the Iraqi Air Force now flies 3 C-130s. And all our training for them is to ensure they have the capability to continue training their own pilots, their own flight engineers, their own load masters, and that the logistics systems that support those aircraft maintain those. As the Secretary said earlier in his opening statement, or later on in the question, this is a country that has resources, and they can do that. Our job is to help them organize so they can take care of those kind of assets. So you're absolutely right, and I don't have a time frame when they're going to be totally self-sufficient across the board. It's part of an ongoing process, a lot of which rests with the Iraqi government.
But at the current level, that after a couple of years, and the fact that they've got a couple that can, or 3 C-130s that are being flown by the Iraqis themselves, that's a far cry from being able to provide their own combat support and their own combat service support. Is that included in the supplemental budget request? I've only seen and have read a draft of the request, but is that part of the plan that's in there for the Iraqi security forces?
Yes, part of the plan is to develop the combat support, combat service support that supports the forces out front. That's absolutely part of the plan, and part of what we're going to help the Iraqis do. How much funding we put towards that, and how much the Iraqis put towards that, we would hope that the Iraqi government would put a lot of resources to it. And in the meantime, we'll help provide those enablers that enable them to go do what they need to do.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. The gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Everett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And first of all, let me thank the Chairman for adhering to the 5-minute rule. I was interested in the comments that you made on increased compensation to our survivors of those that are killed while they're on military duty. I have the bill in the House which mirrors the bill of Senator Sessions over in the Senate, and I too think that there's a difference in geography here. It does matter that when you're under fire and you're in combat zone, that should have some special consideration. I wouldn't ask you to comment on that, and I'd be just pleased to work. Our bill, I think, has some 70 sponsors or thereabout, co-sponsors. I will be pleased to work with you through this process. General Myers, the dependence of our nation on our space assets is, I think, underestimated and also underappreciated. Could you please describe just briefly, in an unclassified manner, how we're to protect and defend those critical assets from emerging threats?
Well, when you talk about space systems and defense, you've got to think about 3 segments. The ground segment, how you protect the security of the ground segment, the uplinks, and then, of course, the on-orbit segment. And one of the first things you have to do is to know when you're under attack. And it's been one of those issues with space systems that's sometimes very hard to determine if, in fact, you're under attack. I think it was a Hughes satellite back in the 90s that went down. It had a lot of the pagers on it in this country and around the world, and it wasn't known for quite some time after analysis what actually happened. And that's what we face today. And so as we put new systems up, every new system that we develop is built with the idea in mind, okay, how can we provide warning that we're actually under attack? That's obviously the first thing you have to think about. And so we're doing that. But space systems, by virtue of where they are and the ambiguity sometimes in malfunctions, whether it's a weather-related phenomena or actually somebody bringing it under attack, has to be designed into the whole system. The ground segment's a little bit easier in that we can provide the same kind of physical security that we provide to other fixed locations. And of course, the up and down links are a challenge because they are susceptible to jamming. I would say another important piece of that, so we understand it well, is that the intelligence to know what threats are out there to our systems has to be well developed. When I was commander of U.S. Space Command, that was one of the areas that I thought could be enhanced, that we needed more intel focus on threats to our space segment. Absolutely.
Well, obviously, General Lloyd's doing an outstanding job out there, but are we considering hardening our assets?
Yes, absolutely, and that was what I was alluding to, I think, and we probably can't go much further in this, but we've got to look. Warning is part of it, hardening is part of it, and for all new space systems, those will all be considered, and as it usually comes down to, it'll come down to a risk equation, and we'll balance risk versus cost, and then try to determine what it is we specifically want to do to a given system.
And I understand we're looking at using reversible methods in denying adversaries certain ways to get to our assets.
There are several concepts of operations that can mitigate the impact of having large fixed assets in space and their vulnerability. And I think we probably ought to stop there in this audience.
Let me comment on RNAP just a moment, which is under jurisdiction of my subcommittee. I'm not taking a position on outside groups advising or proliferation and those issues. Mr. Secretary, what I would like to have a clear understanding, because we've passed this in the subcommittee, we've passed it in the full committee, we've narrowly passed it on the floor, and then we lost it in the appropriation process by the one vote. Could you please tell me directly if there's a military need for this, for robust nuclear earth penetrator?
That's I guess our time is almost out again. It is a question that's difficult to answer, because sometimes they say military requirement, and that's a formal process. There was no military requirement for military aircraft, for example. There was no military requirement for unmanned aerial vehicles until they came along. And so what I believe there is a need for the study, which is what we're talking about here, not a weapon. We're talking about taking existing weapons and doing a study to see if they can be reduced in their power, their lethality, to a level that's lower than the current weapons are, so that they might have the ability to penetrate the earth in a way that could help protect the United States of America. I think that it is clearly in our country's interest to do the study. Do you want to comment on whether there's a, quote, military requirement?
You bet. Our combatant commander that is charged by this nation to worry about countering the kind of targets, deeply buried targets, certainly thinks there's need for this study, and General Cartwright has said such. I think that. I think the Joint Chiefs think that, and so the study is that. It's not a commitment to go forward with a system. It's just to see if it's even feasible.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman from Arkansas, Dr. Snyder.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, gentlemen, Ms. Jonas, for being here today. We appreciate you, and we want you to succeed in everything that you do. General Myers, you had mentioned a while ago, I think it was you that mentioned the Matrix room, and I've heard of Matrix the movie. I have never heard of Matrix the room. And I mean, what is this room? And why, if there's information in there, why can't that be transferred over here so that we could actually see it and make this Matrix room for the day so we could find out how we're doing? What is this room? Is it open to the press? Can we take constituents over there? Is it classified? What is the Matrix room?
A lot of the data is classified. Some of it is not classified. It's a room where we track our progress against the tasks that I had, the objectives and the tasks that I had on that board. And it's...
Is there any reason that information couldn't be compiled on a regular basis? I mean, just, is it on the walls or something and transferred over here to the committee that we might, or do we need to take weekly or monthly tours over there to the Matrix room?
We are just standing it up. I mean, we've got it in operation, and it continues to evolve. We'll have to look at that. I can't answer that right now, sitting in front of you.
But if we want to go there now,
if anybody wants to come see it, I'll offer you to come see it. I don't know that you'd find a lot of interest in looking at it weekly. I think that's, but certainly the information is important, and that's why we're tracking it.
Right. Secretary Rumsfeld, you mentioned the election as being a wonderful step on the way, and I agree with you. And one of the issues that was discussed prior to the election was, would there be adequate security? And you all beefed up forces, and whatever you did seemed to work well to give a period of calm there, for the period of time during the elections. One of the issues that has gone on for some time has been whether there was an adequate level of U.S. forces in Iraq. Would you respond, if you will, to this question. It seems like you beefed up forces during the period leading up to the election, and that was successful, that there was less violent acts for a couple of week period there. Is that not evidence, and maybe still be evidence as we go forward, as we're looking for ways to achieve the success that we all want, that even now perhaps there should be higher levels of U.S. forces, since it did seem to work during that 2-week period around the election?
That's a reasonable question for sure. We've basically had 17 brigades, went up to, I think, 20, 19 and a half or 20.
20, sir.
Brigades during the period where we overlapped our troops for the election, as you suggested. It's not clear to me that the commanders on the ground said that's what they recommended, and we agreed. It's not clear to me that that is what led to the peaceful election period. If you think about it, the Iraqi security forces had the first perimeter and the second perimeter, and U.S. forces were standing back ready to be of assistance, but the Iraqi security forces deserve a lot of credit for the success of that. We're now at the point where we're planning to return the force, as the overlap is ending, back down to about 17 brigades in the period immediately ahead, and those forces will be returning home. I think the answer to the question is that it's part the military security situation, which is a function of the Iraqis plus the coalition forces. It's part the economic circumstance. It's part the amount of money that's flowing into the insurgents. Are they able to hire more criminals to do these things and buy more weapons? Right now, I'm told that access to some of those weapons is gotten more expensive, which suggests we may have been successful in capturing a lot of caches, and that they're no longer available to those people. So it's such a mix of things. I wouldn't want to tie a string from one to the other necessarily.
General Myers, some time ago when we had a discussion here about Abu Ghraib and the things that had happened there, you made a public commitment here, I believe, that you wanted everything out on the open. I think your phrase was everything would be on the table. As you may know, there's now litigation, I think, involving a paper in Denver over trying to see records about or observe the criminal proceedings involving the death of General Mahoush. And in fact, I'm told that the legal documents contain your statement in which you make an affirmation to the American people that everything will be out on the table. It seems like everything is not out on the table, that we're still having to look through a glass darkly. The American people are to find out what happened, what's happening with these incidents that nobody wants and everyone wants to put behind us, remove the stain, I think Secretary Schlesinger had said. Is everything out on the table, General Myers?
I'll start and I'll let Secretary Rumsfeld finish up. We've had, I think it's 15 investigations on the various aspects of detainee abuse, initiated by the Department of Defense or by Central Command or by then the Joint Task Force 7 in Iraq. Those have all been made available as they are completed. There have been over 100, well over 100 people that have been found guilty of various pieces and abuses that have been prosecuted under the UCMJ. So I think we have. When I made that statement, I can't speak for all the legal intricacies of newspapers suing for information that they may not be entitled to, and I don't know the facts in that case at all, so I can't speak on it. But every investigation that we've done has been made available. Every bit of information that I know of has been made available, and I think I'll let the Secretary finish that. And before I do, let me just correct the record. I think it was Congressman Skelton said I was from Kansas, but I was born in Missouri, and that may have been the reason that when I said metrics, you thought I said matrix. But I don't know about a matrix room, and I don't know about matrices. I do know about metrics, and that's what I was referring to. So maybe my accent threw you off. Apologize.
Well, maybe Dr. Snyder saw the movie Metrics. Who knows?
I didn't understand the movie either.
I thank the gentleman, and if there's additional answers, I would ask our witnesses to provide those for the record. And the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Jones.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much, and I'll be very brief, but I've got 2 yes and no questions for the Secretary of Defense, and I appreciate a yes or no answer to these 2, and then I've got a question for an answer. Prior to the war in Iraq, did David Wormser head a group known as the Policy Counterterrorism Evaluation Group, yes or no?
I'm afraid I didn't hear the first part of your question.
Prior to the war in Iraq, did David Wormser, and I guess that's the way you pronounce his name, did he head the Policy Counterterrorism Evaluation Group?
Have you ever heard of that?
A yes or no, and if you don't know, I would appreciate an answer.
I have no idea.
Okay. Prior to the war in Iraq, did the Department of Defense have a financial relationship with the Rendon Group, R-E-N-D-O-N Group? Yes or no?
I don't know.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, I would like to ask on that if I could get an answer, a yes or no, and also would like to ask for the record.
Sure, we can get those answered for the record.
That we have an explanation of the relationship if there was one.
Okay, if you can answer those for the record, Ms. Secretary, that'd be fine.
Fine.
Mr. Secretary, you shared a quote with us from Lincoln. I want to share one with you. To care for him who shall have borne the battle and for his widow and his orphan. That was Lincoln's second inaugural address, March 4th, 1865. I want to share with you a quote from Mr. David Chew. Congress has gone too far in expanding military retiree benefits. I would hope, I believe you are a very caring and sensitive man, and I mean that most sincerely. But that statement by David Chew was very insensitive. This past Sunday in the Raleigh, North Carolina paper, it's a large front page article of a soldier who returned from Iraq. He's lost both legs above his knees. He's lost an arm. He returned back to a young wife and a young child, 4 or 5 years old. He cannot even play games with his daughter anymore. I do not know how we as a Congress, this administration, and also the Department of Defense, we must remember that those who are wearing the uniform have got to come first when they return. And for Mr. Chew to make that statement, I want to very quickly, again, I want to read what a retiree said. I wonder if Mr. Chew ever considered how hard it was at Normandy, in the jungles of the South Pacific, or the freezing battlefields of Korea as he sits in his office and degrades those old warriors seeking benefits they earn. I guess my question to you, have you had a conversation with Mr. Chew about his statement?
No, I have not, and nor have I seen the statement that you've quoted in the context that it might have been included. I know David Chew. He's sitting behind me. He's a person who has worked with great dedication for this country, and he is involved deeply with programs for the severely injured service members, for families of severely injured service members, for families of those who have fallen, and he has been the point person in the department for a whole host of things that reflect a sensitivity and a concern and an understanding and a respect for those people.
I believe that, Mr. Secretary. I would ask you to have your staff to get you a copy of the interview he gave to the Wall Street Journal. And if that was taken out of context, I would understand. But I truly believe that the misunderstanding, if it was a misunderstanding, or maybe Mr. Chew didn't clarify his comments. For those of us who serve districts with retirees and military vets, I have over 61,000 in the 3rd District of North Carolina. Mm-hmm. This president, who I supported and still support, is recommending in his budget a 14% increase in what I call foreign aid. It's under the title of International Affairs. And yet there are also recommendations for a reduction in cuts in veterans' benefits. If we're going to ask these brave men and women to put the uniform on, to go give their life in Iraq and Afghanistan, and over 10,000 have returned without limbs or other injuries, then I hope that we as a Congress, in a bipartisan way, Republican and Democrat, and the administration at this time Republican, we will show that we truly care for those, as Lincoln said years ago. And I hope that you will look into the interview with Mr. Chu, and if by chance the interview is accurate, you would please make a public statement regarding that interview if it is accurate. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
If I could just make a comment, I'm not familiar with the cuts you're referring to, but I have some familiarity with the increase in what you called foreign aid, and I mentioned it in my opening remarks. The cost of maintaining a U.S. military person overseas in Afghanistan or in Iraq is about 1/16 of what it costs to maintain an Iraqi or a Afghan. And what we've tried to do is to find ways to get funds authorized that we can get more non-Americans involved in being trained and equipped to provide security in the world, so the burden falls much less on American servicemen. And I hope that the members will take a careful look at that, because I think from the standpoint of our country, it's money very well spent.
I thank the gentleman. The gentlelady from California, Ms. Sanchez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Secretary and General, for being before us once again today. I had the opportunity at Christmas time, as you'll recall, Mr. Secretary, to be in Iraq. And
I saw you there.
Yes, we ran into each other there while you were addressing the troops. And I want to thank you again for the work that you've been doing. I had the opportunity to talk to General Petraeus when I was out there during that visit, and I read him a statement. I'm going to read it to you because I think I take a little offense to some of the stuff that you've said earlier about some of us who have questioned the fitness of the Iraqi security forces. We're not questioning because we don't want them to succeed. We're questioning because, in fact, we want them to succeed, and we're trying to figure out what these numbers that the administration throws around really mean. To General Petraeus, I read to him, when the insurgents mounted a coordinated offensive in Mosul against 8 police stations in November, most of the police deserted their posts and have not returned. 3/4 of the 4,000 police simply ran away. And during the insurgent assault, the ranks of one Iraqi Guard battalion dropped from 1,100 to less than 300 in a few hours. Another 2 companies of Iraqi National Guards, about 200 men, simply disappeared with all their new weapons and equipment. And today, of course, at that time, we were struggling to regain control of that city, Mosul, which, of course, was where Petraeus had been with the 101st, and it had been a great success. I asked him to comment on that. Was that right? Were the words I said correct? And, you know, he basically had to acknowledge that that's what happened there. I said to him, what was the problem? Why is it falling apart? And he began to tell me that we had moved our troops out of Mosul into Fallujah for the Fallujah assault. And so when I asked him, well, doesn't that indicate that maybe if we had had other troops to put in Fallujah, we wouldn't have had this problem in Mosul? And he said to me, and I remember the words, it's pretty obvious, isn't it, Ms. Sanchez? So I'm glad that Mr. Snyder talked about, you know, do we really need a force of 150 plus in Iraq? I think any reduction, and this is important to the budget, any near-term reduction of the troops in Iraq really depend on 2 main factors: the strength of the insurgency and the size and the readiness of the Iraqi army and other security forces. Since there has been no abatement lately, in particular in the intensity of this insurgency, we're basically depending on our efforts to train, equip, and deploy Iraqi forces. And unfortunately, as I said, this committee has had a hard time assessing where we really stand with the Iraqi army as an effective fighting force. Over the past year, we've received incredibly widely fluctuating estimates of that. And I think you have a real credibility problem on this issue. And
fluctuations of what?
the fluctuations, the numbers that you banty around about how many troops we really have out there that are Iraqi police, et cetera, et cetera. First, you estimate that there are currently 136,000 trained Iraqi security forces in the field. About 79,000 of those are police and other interior ministry troops. While the police play a role in counterinsurgency, they are not organized, trained, or equipped to engage in combat operations. We rely mainly on the Iraqi Army and the National Guard to take the lead in counterinsurgency fighting, not the police. Isn't that right, Mr. Secretary?
Mr. Secretary, before you answer that question, let me advise my colleagues that we've got a 15-minute vote. Because we've got a time crunch and we want to get our members in questions out, we're going to keep going. I know Ms. Tauscher and Mr. Hayes are next, and we'll go right down to the last few seconds on the vote, and we will keep going. I'll have Mr. Saxton coming back, and we'll keep the hearing going. So if you're in line to ask a question, if you get over and vote right now and get on back, you'll be queued up. Thank you. Okay, I'll try to answer rapidly. First, there's no question but that incidents like you describe have occurred. They've occurred in militaries across the world, and they happen. I think that fewer of them have happened lately, and they're getting better. Second, you're correct that the strength of the insurgency is one part of the equation. The other is the capability and the numbers. It's not just numbers, but capability of the security forces. And plus the progress on the economic and political side. I think it's important to keep those things in mind because they are going to affect the intensity of the insurgency. Third, in the materials we provide you, there are, I think, 12 or 15 different categories. There are police, civil intervention force, emergency response, border enforcement, highway patrol, dignitary protection, special police commandos for the Interior Department, Army, National Guard, intervention force, special operations, Air Force, Navy for the military. Now, you say we bandy around numbers. They're not my numbers. I don't invent them. They come from General Petraeus. Could you move your head just a little bit? Thank you. If you look up there, I meant your whole body. I didn't mean just the head. If you look up there, what you'll see is that the numbers originally, as I said in my remarks, included site protection people. And that dropped it by about 70,000. We originally talked about on duty only. Then we changed it and said trained. Then we took the site protection out. This has all been perfectly transparent to everybody. There's no bantying at all. And now we're saying trained and equipped just in the Ministry of Interior and Defense. They are Petraeus's numbers. Third, fourth.
I have Petraeus's numbers. They're different than your numbers, by the way.
Well, what's the date? They aren't different because these came from Petraeus. He may have two sets of numbers, but they are not different if the date's the same. The date on my paper here is February 14th. What's yours?
December 20th.
Not surprising there's a difference.
But the difference is different in different categories, not in the same.
If the gentleman will hold on for a minute. The gentlelady's time is up, and we're going to try to knock out a few more questions here before the
Mr. Chairman,
I'm going to finish,
if I may. Time, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, Mr. Secretary, if you can wrap up fairly quickly.
I'd like to just finish the last thought. General Petraeus is in charge of the training and equipping of Iraqi security forces. And General Casey and General Abizaid are the ones who advise us as to what the force levels ought to be in the country. And it appears that General Petraeus doesn't agree with them, and that's fine. I'm sure other people don't agree with General Casey or General Abizaid. But I take my advice from on this subject from General Abizaid, General Casey, and General Myers and General Pace, and all four of them think we have the right size force. Thank you.
Well, I talked to General Petraeus last Wednesday night on this very subject, and I don't think he would disagree with the force levels we have there and that the Secretary mentioned earlier. I think he's in agreement with General Casey and General Abizaid.
I thank the gentlelady. I'd like to indulge you with more questions, but if you can make them for the record. We have a number of members. We're about halfway through the hearing here, and we're going to have we have a fairly limited amount of time to get finished. Gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Hayes.
Thank you, gentlemen, for coming and for your assistance in support of our men and women in uniform. We have a very serious situation as it relates to the budget with 90 C-130Es and potentially H models about to go out of service. 18th Airborne Corps and the 82nd Airborne Division are in danger of becoming the 82nd Infantry, and I'm concerned about that. As it relates to the budget and the supplemental, it seems very reasonable to me to take money, and you very appropriately said, Mr. Secretary, you've got needs in there, as Walter referred to, but there's other money going to the UN and other places. We've been very generous with tsunami relief, both the public and the government. We've got to have that money, in my opinion, to get those C-130s back. The inspections occur. We've still got old airplanes. It relates to the tanker situation. We've got to have the platforms that the modularity and other transformation that we all want to see has a delivery component to it. Could you tell me what we can do and how we can move that money out of some less important things into making sure we've got the platforms for our folks?
I think, Dick Myers, if I'm correct, the C-130J is being reviewed.
It is being reviewed, correct.
Being reviewed, and that's good, but that's still 2 years out if you make the right decision.
No, it's being reviewed right now, and we may come back with an amendment to the budget with respect to C-130s.
That's correct.
But that won't get us enough quickly if these airplanes can't go back to flying to solve that problem, will it, General Myers?
Well, if you have an issue with a particular model of an airplane, there's no quick fix. And so I think my understanding is the Air Force is evaluating the models to see if they can be fixed. I think some probably can. Some may be, it may be not cost effective to try to repair the wing boxes that are showing this fatigue and this stress.
31 to 43-year-old aircraft, the hand-wringing bedwetters that say we don't need new platforms have got to get on board, and you guys got to make us give you the money to get those platforms we need.
I would only mention, Congressman Hayes, that part of the mobility capability study that's going to complete will also address the intra-theater lift requirement, which gets into systems and platforms like the C-130, and that will help address the issue you're talking about, which is absolute numbers and what's the right number.
And of course, C-17s get them to theater, and we've got to have the C-130s for training on this side and delivery in theater over there, so please put the heat on it.
No, both those platforms and the C-130 in particular are working really hard right now. You bet. We count on them.
Thank the gentleman, and I thank him for the brevity of the question. And the gentlelady from California, Ms. Tauscher.
Mr. Secretary, General Myers, Mr. Secretary, I have things I agree with you and don't agree with you on. I certainly think we all agree that we have the finest military force in the world and that they are a constant source of pride for all Americans and for people around the world, and I'm happy that the election in Iraq went off without any kind of cataclysmic issues, and I hope that we find in the Shia a gracious winner and that we have an opportunity to get that government stood up as soon as possible. Where we don't agree consistently is on this issue of the supplemental. I'm really concerned that the Pentagon's decision to rely on the supplemental to fund operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, which I consider to be, in Iraq's case, a war of choice, is basically funding a war of choice on borrowed money. And we have a lot of issues. I think that there's bipartisan concern that the use of these supplementals to fund existing operations just isn't kosher. We have, for example, the whole issue of modularity, which right now in the budget you say should be paid for in supplementals in 05 and 06. We know exactly what we're doing. It's all pretty predictable. I don't know why we can't budget for them now, and I guess sometime in 07 we're going to start to put them in the budget. But can you tell me, how is modularity an emergency item?
I think I can. First of all, it's not a Pentagon decision. It's a decision that's made with the Executive Branch, OMB, and the Congress, and the Appropriations Committees and the Authorization Committees. It's not the Pentagon and it's not me, and your characterization of it was imperfect.
That old Rumsfeld talking to me now?
The second thing I would say is, I think so. I think it is, yes.
Much prefer new Rumsfeld.
No, you don't either. No. On the modularity, that's complicated, but the reason it has to be in the in the supplemental for the first period is because, unlike what you said, that it's all clear and we know what we're doing, the answer is we don't. It is in its early stages, and we're doing the first pieces, and the first pieces are in fact done. But to actually project out and know with certainty what the effect of all of the things taking place in the Army will be, we can't know that yet. Simultaneously, they're going to a more modular system, increasing from 33 to 43 combat brigades, rebalancing the Guard and the Reserve, and there are too many moving parts to have certainty on it, and we just don't.
If the gentlelady will indulge us here, Mr. Meeks, if she'll give him a little time, can get his question in before the vote.
That would be great. Why don't we talk about this, we'll correspond.
Appreciate the gentlelady, the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Meek.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. It's just a couple of things. Well, first of all, I was called on recently. As you know, this month is Black History Month, and I've been called on by quite a few people to talk about African Americans in the military. And I can tell you that I was posed a question back in my district of how many four-star African American generals do we have now in the military, and I was shocked to find out, especially in the Army and in the Marines, there are none as it stands now. Maybe you may have other additional information. Also, there are no 3-stars. And I believe that out of the 32 in the Army, there's a number of, I think that there's a, somewhere in the neighborhood of 1 or 2. There are only 2 3-stars that are in the Army right now. That's something that I would recommend possibly if you can get back to me on to let me know a little bit more about and how the military is working on that. You answered one of my questions earlier. I know General Myers steered about Abu Ghraib because you know that's one of the concerns. And, Mr. Secretary, I also want to commend you on following through when you came to the committee at a very difficult time for not only for Americans, but also for our country and the coalition forces when we had discussions about not only your future in the Department of Defense, and that you said you were considering it, and later to find out watching one of my favorite shows, Mr. Larry King, that you did offer the President to move on and allow someone else to lead. And I just want to say I know that was a difficult thing for you to do, and I just want to let you know as a member of this committee I appreciate the fact that you did give the President that option, and he decided to continue to move forth under your leadership. As it relates to the insurgency in Iraq, I recently did travel over and had an opportunity to talk with many of the generals over there. I'm very concerned about the question of, and I'm going to have to run and vote, the question of, are we allowing the insurgency to keep us in the fight? We say we don't want to start talking about dates. We say we don't want to start talking about turning parts of Iraq over to Iraqis totally so that we can start taking down our numbers in Iraq. But I'm afraid that we're getting into, we can't let the terrorists win, and we'll end up being there for a number of years and not having the Iraqi forces take on the responsibilities that I think they should be taking on more sooner than later, and the training has a lot to do with it. So that's pretty much where it is. The first part was a statement. I know you probably didn't come prepared.
I can give you a quick answer.
Thank you, sir.
2 4-star African-American just retired, General Ellis and General Lyles, I believe. One was Air Force, one was Army. General Ward, who just was appointed by Condi Rice to assist with the security in the Middle East with the Palestinian Authority, is an African American. Notwithstanding that, you asked how we're working on it. We work on it. General Myers and I meet with General Pace and Dr. Wolfowitz once a week on military personnel. It is something that has to start obviously down at the lower levels so that they can punch all the tickets and go through War College and do all the things they have to do, the commands, to get up to a 3 or 4-star level. And the fact of the matter is there aren't as many African American or Hispanic senior officers as there ought to be in the military, and it's something we recognize. The military has to be representative of the country if it's going to be successful.
Let me just add, as you know, Mr. Meek, there is no institution in this country, I don't believe, that promotes on merit as much as the Department of Defense does. So if you can do the task, you can get promoted. Two, let me ask you, with African Americans, we need your help. When you speak to groups, encourage them to come into the military service. Encourage them to make long commitments that some don't want to make in terms of pilot training and other fields where they can rise to leadership positions. It's just so important, and your influence there would be incredibly important.
Mr. Chairman, I'm going to run and try to make this vote, but let me just say, I mean, you had me at hello on that question, but as it stands to right now, I mean, as present, because of recent departures, I mean, that's what it was reported as we were preparing as it relates to 4 stars. And I just was receiving a BlackBerry as I'm talking to you because my staff didn't know I was up this early. They tell me that you are looking and interviewing 2 and 1 stars right now, going that far down to bring the diversity numbers up. And I think that's important to the future recruitment efforts and talent that we want in our military. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you, Mr. Meeks. Mrs. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Secretary, you know, our men and women are doing a fantastic job in Iraq and Afghanistan, and we're really concentrating hard on the global war on terror right now. But while doing that, it seems to me that we're concentrating so much of our efforts on that perhaps we're making relatively short-term budget concessions, such as cutting ships, cutting aircraft at the risk of sacrificing our long-term national security. One, I'd like to know what your assessment is of that, if you think we are putting our men and women and our national security at risk by some of these short-term decisions. And two, the recent PBD release and budget proposal appear to signal a shift in the underlying assumptions of our strategic defense structure. If the QDR hasn't started and won't start until March of this year, was the decision to cut the FA-22s and to cut shipbuilding, our carrier fleet, from 12 to 11. Why was that decision made? And it was made before the analysis even begins, let alone before it's completed. So my question to you is it not fair to say that our budgetary decisions are driving and taking precedence over our strategic preferences, and are we not putting our future at risk?
That is always the $64 question year after year. Resources are finite. We always know that. It's not unlimited. Choices have to be made. Priorities have to be established, and they are. In this budget, the Department of Defense got a sizable increase of something like $19 billion. What is it, 4.8% increase, unlike other departments and agencies. In direct answer to your question, the war is not doing that. The war is being funded separately. And so it is not squeezing out the future. It's simply a matter of having to make the kinds of choices that have been made for decades in this country. With respect to the FA-22, the answer is that the review is going to take place in the quadrennial defense review. The buy is continuing through what, 07, 08? And it's up to, I think, 176 or 179 aircraft. And the question is, do we need 2 wings or 1 wing or 1.5 wings? And it's going to be reviewed. And it's a serious matter. It's an excellent airplane from everything I've been told. And that thought and analysis that needs to be done about what will be the air circumstance of our country in the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years is a serious question. And these are enormously expensive aircraft. What are they, $250 million apiece? $257 apiece, so it's not like they're cheap.
Well, before the time runs out, I'm really interested very much so in the carrier fleet. And I understand that the defense budget has gone up considerably, but for the last several years, shipbuilding is continuing to go down in a steady decline. I understand we always talk about capabilities, but with all due respect, you could have ships with all the capabilities in the world, but they can only be in one place at one time.
Well, let's talk a little about that. I've been enormously impressed with what the Navy has done, Vern Clark and Gordon England. Previously, 3 or 4 years ago, our capability was to have, we had 12 carriers, battle groups. We could have 3 of them at any one time out, plus a surge of 2. So that's 5 out of 12. Not impressive. Expensive, but not impressive. The way they've rearranged things with crew swaps and reducing transit time and increasing the spares and reducing overhaul and repair time, now they're at 5 or 6 plus 1 or 2 with the same sized fleet. Now that's an enormous change. The capability that there is just enormous difference. Next, we talk about the size of the Navy, and the size of the Navy is important. What's really important, however, is what portion of the Navy is deployable at any given moment. When we had 485 ships, we routinely deployed 102, about a fifth of it. With 290 ships, we routinely deploy 95, which is a third. So we're able to deploy not a fifth, but a third of the fleet because of management improvements. That's the second important fact. The third important fact is lethality. I mean, the capability of these ships is so much greater. And I think we showed a chart up there to show let's back up. And I can't find it here, but it's somewhere.
My time's almost up, Mr. Secretary, but I think we use 70% of our ships in the Operation Enduring Freedom, if I'm not mistaken. Is that not correct?
I don't know. I can find out.
Time's up, but I'd love to discuss it later.
Gentlelady's time has expired. We're going to go now to my neighbor from New Jersey, Mr. Andrews.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank the Secretary, General Myers, all the witnesses for their participation. And I must say, I do want to take a moment and reflect on the achievement of the men and women that you lead and your colleagues in other federal departments. That if someone would have told us 5 years ago we'd be sitting here in a world where Afghanistan had free elections involving women fully, and Iraq had a very successful election under very difficult circumstances and offers the very real prospect of the evolution of a law-abiding, human rights-respecting government, I would not have believed it. And I think that the men and women you lead are in a great way responsible for that, and I hope you will express our appreciation to them for that achievement. I'm very concerned, though, that the achievement won't take hold unless we see some dramatic improvements in the situation in Iraq. And Mr. Secretary, I apologize for not being present when you said it, but my understanding is that when Mr. Skelton asked the question about your best estimate of the number of resistance fighters, that your comment was that you're not in the business of intelligence and that it's not a number that you know. Is that a fair statement of your answer?
What I said was that I have in my hot little hand differing views from DIA and CIA. He cited an Iraqi view that was totally inconsistent with it. My job in the government is not to be the principal intelligence officer and try to rationalize differences between Iraqis, the CIA, and the DIA. I see these reports. Frankly, I don't have a lot of confidence in any of them.
Yeah. It is your job and
on that number.
Yeah, I understand. It is your job and it's our job with you to determine whether we have the forces that are sufficient to suppress the resistance, to transition to an Iraqi force, and to build the civil society that's needed there. And clearly, it is your conclusion that we have adequate forces. Is that right?
Absolutely, or we'd have some other number. If the General Myers and General Casey and Abizaid and the President concluded that the number was wrong, we'd change it. We've said that.
Is the size of the force then predicated upon the worst case set of intelligence numbers for the size of the resistance or something else?
It's as I've indicated, I think you have to look at the political progress, the economic progress, and the nature of the insurgency, and then balance the security forces against that. Second, there's another tension, and the tension is this. The bigger the force, the heavier the footprint, the more intrusive foreigners are, and the greater the feeling of occupation and heavy footprint. The lighter the force, the more the Iraqis are out front, the less intrusive and the less offensive it is, and maybe the earlier you will find the Iraqi people taking hold of their own country. So that is the dilemma. That's the tension.
I understand. I understand that quantity and efficacy are not the same thing. I do understand that. I have a question that leads to
a few years down the road, it is no one's desire, I'm sure, that we would be engaged in a full-scale conflict in another hotspot in the world, Iran, North Korea. No one desires that. No one plans for it. I don't think anybody wants it. If, however, we were to find ourselves in such a situation, and if we still had the force deployment we do in Iraq 2-3 years from now, if you take into account the modularity gains which you are anticipating, 43 active duty brigades and the active service by the end of fiscal 07, is that enough? Would that be enough for us to have the force size that we presently have in Iraq and have a force scaled to do the job that might need to be done in an Iran or North Korea, or is it insufficient?
We evaluate that periodically. And as I said in my opening statement, we can handle the tasks that are outlined in the National Defense Strategy that this country expects its military to handle. So, in short, yes, if there's another situation, let's say on the Korean Peninsula,
Right.
U.S. forces can respond and deal with that situation.
But is that assuming that the modularity process works, the modernization works, and that's what frees up the skill sets that you need, or is that assuming greater use of Guard and Reserve or greater end strength? What's that assumption based on?
Well, there are several assumptions that would go into that. One is that we would shift some of the strategic lift to move forces to the Pacific, and we'd have to potentially mobilize some reserve components that have been mobilized once in the last several years, of course. But if we had two conflicts like that, that's what that's what the reserves would want to do themselves. That'd be a very serious situation. But we are tasked as a military to be able to do basically two, and we called it in the last QDR, two swiftly defeat the efforts of, which are two conflicts, taking one conflict to a more enduring outcome, which is what we find ourselves involved in Iraq today. We can still do that today.
Yeah.
Now, the timeliness of our response might not be totally consistent with what the combatant commander wants and so forth, but we can respond.
Make the case that it would be 3 because we have 2 that are ongoing. Mr. Chairman, my time is up, but I did want to ask if the chairman would consider, the Secretary made reference to the DIA and CIA estimates that he sees with respect to size of the resistance force. If the chairman would ask the department and the relevant agencies to arrange for a classified briefing for this committee so that we can hear those estimates as well in due course.
Mr. Chairman, this whole issue of numbers of insurgents is an important question. But as we look at insurgencies, if you look at in China, Mao's insurgents at their low point were greatly outnumbered by the Chinese forces. I mean, greatly outnumbered, and yet they persevered to win. So it's not about numbers. What we do know about these insurgents is that overall they're not very effective. They can spike in capability, as we saw before elections, but it goes back down to a steady state. We know that they're losing the battle for the hearts and minds of the Iraqi people. We saw it on election day, and I think that will make that gave the Iraqi people a lot more confidence as they went out and saw other Iraqis going to the polls. And the insurgents were certainly set back by that phenomena, as they were in Afghanistan, and as we see now, Taliban in Afghanistan wanting to come and rejoin the political process in
I think we understand. We just want to see them lose a lot faster.
We're going to have to move on. The gentleman.
But it's an important issue, and I'd say the insurgents' future is absolutely bleak. So precise numbers in an insurgency where some people come and go is always going to be hard to estimate, and that's what we're trying to say.
Thank you, General. The gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Forbes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, thank you for your patience in answering our questions as we strive to set the priorities in our budget that I know the administration had to set in theirs. And as we look at this budget or any budget, we realize that many of the platforms we're talking about are not going to happen tomorrow. They're 5 years out, maybe 7 years out. And the temptation for us is certainly to look at Iraq and perhaps even Iran. But I've got a big concern, too, is we just got back from visiting China, and I see what's going on over over there with their Navy. I believe very strongly if they're not moving towards a policy of denial with their Navy, certainly they're moving towards, or a policy of control, they're certainly trying a policy of denial in the creation and buildup of their Navy. And the question that I'd have is, as we met with them, it seems clear to us that they have an overall policy for shipbuilding that includes where their manpower is going to be, where their resources are going to be. We looked at their steel mills. They're throwing out steel as fast as you can watch it, running it 24 hours a day. In addition to that, they're building, at least on their commercial ships, they're turning them around in 6 months from start to finish, and they didn't give us the luxury of looking at their military ship construction, of course. But my question is just twofold. One, do we have anywhere written a overall shipbuilding plan for the United States which takes into account not just the number of ships that we need, but where our workforce needs are going to be and how they're going to be met 5 years down the road as we're creating them, our resources for putting them together? And if so, could you just let us know where that is so I could study that and look at it? And the second thing is, I noticed that we have, it looks like a $1.26 billion cut in shipbuilding from what the administration proposed in the 05 budget and what we have proposed this year. And my question there is, why that cut? Because I recognize that we have technology concerns, but that didn't take place over 12 months. The threat certainly has not decreased over that period of time, and if you look at all of the adjustments we've made in the Navy, they haven't taken place just over the 12-month period of time, and maybe you could indicate to us why we had that kind of decrease in our shipbuilding budget over that 12-month window.
First of all, your point on the People's Republic of China is, of course, correct. They are investing, they're growing rapidly, and they're making significant investments in defense capabilities, military capabilities. They are buying a great deal of equipment from Russia. They're making an increasing amount of equipment. It's more advanced technologically. They're actively trying to get access to European technology by getting the arms embargo ban lifted from the European Union, which it looks like the European Union is along the track to do at some point. They are increasingly moving their Navy further distances from their shores in various types of exercises and activities, and that's a reality. You had so many questions in there. Let me see if I can pull out another one. The question of the budget. The Navy budget has been increased. It is lower than the number. And the request we're making is higher than the authorization last year. Is that not correct?
That is correct.
Mr.
Second,
Secretary.
it is below the number that was in the budget for 07 last year. Yes, you started to.
Just that maybe I have wrong figures. I was just given figures of $9.96 billion for the 05.
Could you speak up a little bit? I can't hear you.
I was given figures of $9.96 billion for 05, and then we had $8.7 billion in the 06 budget, and maybe I have wrong figures on that, so maybe I'll look at whatever figures that you have. And that's for shipbuilding that I'm looking at specifically.
Oh, just for shipbuilding. I don't have that number. I was talking about the United States Navy, but.
Sir, we are down a bit in the shipbuilding account, and primarily it was a change in plan from the 05 enacted level. We're down 2 ships. Primarily, the Congress asked for a gap ship in the LCS, Littoral Combat Ship, so that was slipped a year, and the TAKE slipped a year.
And Mr. Chairman, my question, and again, if you don't have the information now, if you could just get it back to me, but it's my understanding that from the administration budget, not what we authorized, but the administration budget a year ago was $9.96 billion for shipbuilding, and this year it's $8.7 billion. And if those figures are wrong, I stand to be corrected. But my question was, what happened in the 12-month period of time? Because we're looking at 5-year projections and 7-year projections. What happened in 12 months to lead us to want to reduce the shipbuilding budget by approximately $1.26 billion?
Sir, you may recall that we got congressional direction to slip one of the ships, a so-called gap year for design. So that would have counted for one of the ships.
The other thing that happened, while the Navy budget, I believe, is up from year to year, last year to this year's request, the projection from last year for this year was higher than we're coming in requesting. And the reason for that, obviously, is because the President looked at the total budget and the deficit, made a judgment, and decided to increase the Defense Department's budget only $19 billion instead of some larger number that had been projected. As a result, the services and the department went down and took a look at their circumstances, came back up and said, given the figure we're now planning on, we still have an increase. All the services have an increase, but it's a smaller increase than they'd hoped, and therefore they had to make some adjustments in their budget, and that may have been a factor as well.
Mr. Chair, my time's out, but if you could also, on the shipbuilding plan, at some point in time, just submit that answer to the record for us, and I know I'm out of time.
Sure.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mr. Forbes. I know that we're all anxious to ask these questions, but I just keep in mind that the Secretary's time is limited. And also, the Chairman left me strict instructions about this 5-minute rule. So
we've also have to be at the Senate at a fixed time, and that means we're going to have to get out, get lunch, and get over there. So 1 o'clock's about a hard stop for us.
Thank you. Mrs. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much to Mr. Secretary and General Myers for being here. I want to assure you that there's great interest in the long-term plan for shipbuilding on both sides of the aisle. At the Navy Marine Caucus yesterday, we spoke about this, and we also talked about the capitalization and how we find more sensible ways to do that. And I think we're going to be searching for better ways that the Congress can work with the administration to do that, and certainly with our leaders in the Joint Chiefs. I wanted to just pick up for one moment on the comment that my colleague Mr. Jones made, because I did have an opportunity.
Red light. You've given us a red light before you've even asked your question. How can that be?
How can that be, Mr. Chairman? Do I have a red light already?
No, ma'am. You're fine.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for bringing that to my attention. Appreciate it.
Now it's green. All right.
Okay. I wanted to comment just very briefly on the comment that my colleague Mr. Jones made earlier in response to the article in the Wall Street Journal in which Dr. Chu was quoted. And I did have a chance to ask Dr. Chu in a hearing about that comment, and he had an opportunity to clarify it. But I just wanted to suggest that there's a firestorm out there on that. And it would be very helpful, I think, to further clarify for the American people and also for our veterans. They are concerned, and it might be, and Mr. Chairman, I know I had suggested this earlier, that at some point perhaps bringing the Veterans Committee and the Armed Services Committee together to work together so that we don't make the kind of calculations or statements that pit one against the other. We have veterans benefits, very, very important. We also have great needs in our national security, and I think that we need to address those in a reasonable fashion that don't put people in a position of being very concerned that we're putting one above the other. I also wanted, if you might, to just go to the strategic objectives that you spoke about earlier, and I understand that perhaps there is a wall where we have all those objectives listed. Could you, though, for a moment, give me something that's kind of ballparkish in terms of these areas? Where are we? Is it possible you're aware of the objectives and all the issues that go into that, the metrics, if you will, but can you be more specific with us today in this hearing about where we are? 0 to 5, where are we in neutralizing the insurgents, ensuring legitimate elections, et cetera? Would you be able to go through that and be a little more specific about where we are, and perhaps if you could also be where we are a year ago? Were we further along in some areas? Were we better in establishing a foundation for a strong economy a year ago, before we had the number of insurgent attacks? How are we, and I guess what are your hopes in the next year? Where would you like to be, reasonably?
I don't think we have the time here to go into the kind of detail you just asked, but we can drill down on most of those categories. I'll just remind people that not all of this is a Department of Defense responsibility. We have responsibility certainly for most of the security area, but not entirely. And security is not just forces. It's a lot more of the economic and governance piece and so forth, and just judicial systems, just the ability to prosecute those that attack Iraqis and attack the coalition, to get them through a system and show people that there's a price to pay for their behavior, for their terrorist actions. We can go down in some of those categories. In general, we're certainly better off than we were a year ago. In terms of almost all those categories, we're now nowhere near where we need to be in most of those categories either. And part of it is because, as the chart said, it says assisting Iraqis to achieve those objectives. They're not U.S. objectives to achieve. We have to strengthen Iraqi capacity and confidence and self-reliance. And so it is complex. I mean, it's a very complex thing we're doing. And one of the things that General Luck came back after his assessment and said that he was surprised at the level of devastation, and not devastation physical, but the moral and spiritual devastation of the Iraqi people. They were taught through decades to be helpless and to not raise their hand and ask to show initiative because they would get swatted down. So that all plays in that, and we just don't have time to go into each of those categories. I did not bring all the books that would require.
I appreciate that, General Myers. If you will, could you just take one area then, and the Border Patrol and the number of troops that are at the border of our troops. We have about 10,000 here in the U.S., roughly. Many more connected to other immigration issues, and I'm wondering if you could just cite how adequate we feel the border agents, the numbers are at the border.
Jim, I'll wait till the tail end. I can look that up just a minute, because I don't have, I think it's 20-some thousand. I do know this, that it's not just the number of troops, it's again their capability. So what General Petraeus has been focusing on is their training, their equipping. Also, they need infrastructure at these border crossing points, and they need systems. They need the information technology to compare the kind of passports they're getting and so forth, so they know who's passing and who is legal and who is illegal. And there's the border. Are those border forces there? They are not. They'd be in the other forces, other MOI forces. I think the 21,000. That's when I said 20,000. But I'll look it up here in just a minute. But I don't have it at the tip of my tongue.
Okay. Well, I do see that my time is up. I wanted you, perhaps, at another question. Just you had mentioned earlier that the police, that we were not embedding the police, and yet we know how critical they are to our success strategy, and we all believe fervently that we must have, and that we're very supportive of that success strategy. What is happening then with the police corps if, in fact, we're not
I think what the
embedding
Secretary was referring to, that in anything we do in Iraq has to be worked with the Iraqi government. And it's their choice how they play in this equation on how we assist them. And it was their preference that, at least at the local police level, we do not assist. Now, we understand that the police will play a very important role. Some think, and I happen to agree with them, that the European model of a gendarmerie or something like that would be very appropriate. As you know, there are several countries, France being one of them, that is looking at that kind of training for Iraqi police forces, and we think that will be important. That's not settled yet, but it's being discussed. So the police will play a very important role, and they already have 8 battalions of paramilitary in their police that can confront the insurgency and prevail, and they do daily. That goes to an earlier question that I think, Congressman Joshua, that you asked. There are somebody else, but there are 8 battalions that actually do that work in the Ministry of Interior that are police forces, and so it's terribly important.
Thank you.
I thank the gentlelady. Let me apologize to my colleagues because we have a kind of an unusual situation. We've got the supplemental is moving out, and the Secretary has to, as I understand today, do a big piece of his supplemental testimony and then do another piece of it tomorrow before everybody's gone, so we can get it out and get the supplemental moving for markup. For our members that didn't get a chance to ask a question, first, Ms. Secretary, we want to have the ability to move any questions in writing that they would like to ask. But also, is there a chance we could also perhaps have our members that didn't get a chance to ask a question have a chance to meet with you, maybe do a breakfast, lunch, something maybe in the building at the Pentagon, in which we could
Absolutely. I
have a
took down the
continued
names
dialogue.
of everyone who's left, and we'll get them down for breakfast sometime in the next 2 or 3 weeks.
Okay,
Mr. Chairman?
let's do that.
Mr. Chairman, I have a question.
Yes, the gentlelady's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Would that breakfast with the Secretary be open to the public?
Well, if you want to bring all the omelets, it might be, but
Well, Mr. Chairman, the problem is, and I appreciate your adherence to the 5-minute rule. However, there are many of us who have important questions, and my question in particular is about the 4 war games that were taking place on September 11th and how they may have impaired our ability to respond to the attacks on September 11th.
Well, let me say the gentlelady
I would like that question to be answered in public, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, let me say to the gentlelady, we're going to have other opportunities to have the Secretary in front of us, and what we will do beyond having questions, if you want a question for the record, to be able to put that to the record and have the answer on the record. But additionally, at the next event in which the Secretary testifies, and we'll try to make sure that happens, we will start with the folks that did not get their questions, so that you will have an opportunity to propound your question.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and I hope the record is still open so that even that portion of my comment would be included in this record.
It will be ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, a ranking gentleman is recognized.
10 seconds. Mr. Secretary, at some point in the near future, would you be either on a classified or unclassified basis share with this committee the recommendations of General Luck?
The recommendations of General Luck and his team were oral. They were made to us and to General Casey and General Abizaid. General Casey and General Abizaid are taking those thoughts and making a recommendation to me, which they have not yet made, and to the chairman, which we then will present to the president if it's appropriate or if it's of that level. We'd be happy to have you down and talk about the thoughts that General Luck had.
That's fine. Thank you very much.
Sure. Why don't we make that one of the subjects of our discussion with the Secretary when we go over to the building here. We'll make sure everybody gets a chance to go over. So, Mr. Secretary, I'm sorry this had to be an abbreviated session, but thanks, and we appreciate your service and appreciate the fact you're going to work on the supplemental, and we'll try to get our oar in the water as well on that document.
Mr. Chairman?
Thank you. Gentleman from Hawaii. Yeah.
Not to stop the Secretary, but just for a moment for you. On the issue here, Mr. Chairman, for our point of view, there are some legislative proposals.
Should we go?
That we couldn't go into today anyway, but Mr. Chairman, I just want to go on record with you saying I think the legislative proposals that are part of this package are totally out of line and bypass the ordinary review that we would give them. There's some very, very serious legislative proposals that go way beyond the supplemental, that actually go into the permanent condition, and I would just appreciate very much if you would take note of my concern, which I expect is probably your concern too, and perhaps so we can have an appropriate set of hearings or consideration for these legislative proposals, way beyond just the transfer of money and all the rest.
Okay. I understand the gentleman's concerns, and we will assure him that we're going to look this thing over carefully and address that, the policy proposals that are manifest in that supplemental.
You understand, my point is that I think they're not appropriate for a supplemental budget request, but rather are fundamental to the overall authorization bill because of the permanent nature of many of them.
I understand the gentleman's concern. I share some of those. So thank you. And the hearing, yes, General Myers.
Chairman Hunter, just to answer Congressman Davis's comment on the number of Border Patrol people, is 24,000 is the current number of trained and equipped for Iraqi Border Patrol.
Okay. Thank you. And the hearing is adjourned.
Coming up this morning on C-SPAN, the Canadian House of Commons debates a bill that would legalize same-sex marriage. This morning on Washington Journal, your phone calls and the day's news. Topics on the program also include U.S. policy towards Syria, the cost of the Medicare prescription drug benefit, and the Kyoto Climate Change Treaty.